Nobody called them tricks. They were just the way a black grandmother got dinner on the table with whatever was left in the pantry, and every single method had been tested across 3 generations before it reached your kitchen. A damp cloth under the cutting board so it would not slide, a wooden spoon laid across the top of a boiling pot so it would not spill over, stale bread soaked and fried into something better than it ever was fresh. These were solutions that no cookbook bothered to write down, and they worked every time. Number 63 on this list is a method for testing oil temperature using nothing but a wooden spoon. Number 37 is a freezer rotation trick that turned one chicken into a full week of dinners. And number 12 is a way to bring stale cornbread back to life as a breakfast that tasted better than the original. These were not recipes. These were survival techniques passed hand to hand across generations, and most of them still work today. Hit subscribe because this list runs deep. Number 7, boiled peanuts. Raw peanuts pulled fresh from the ground were common across the deep south from late summer into fall. In white households, they were roasted or ground into peanut butter, but the green peanuts, freshly dug and still damp with soil, went to the cook. She dropped them into a pot of heavily salted water and boiled them for hours until the shells softened and the nuts inside turned creamy and swollen. Boiled peanuts tasted nothing like roasted ones. They were salty, almost briny, with a texture closer to a cooked bean than a nut. A paper sack of boiled peanuts could last a woman through a full afternoon of ironing. She cracked the shells with her teeth, ate the soft nut inside, and dropped the shells into her apron pocket. The tradition crossed racial lines in ways that few other foods on this list did. White children ate boiled peanuts at county fairs and roadside stands. But in the domestic worker's kitchen, boiled peanuts was something different. They were a food she made for herself on her own time from something that grew in dirt and cost almost nothing. She did not need the family's oven or their butter or their sugar. She needed a pot, salt, water, and time. Those were the only ingredients she controlled completely. Boiled peanut season ran from August through October, and during those weeks, the smell of salted shells simmering carried across porches and down unpaved streets. A woman who had spent the day seasoning someone else's food sat on her own steps and ate peanuts she had cooked herself. That small sovereignty mattered. The shells piled up beside her on the step, proof of something she had made and eaten entirely on her own terms. Number 17, Geechee red rice in Harlem. Plenty of Harlem cooks had Gullah grandmothers back in coastal South Carolina and Georgia. They brought red rice up with them on the train. Corrine's friend Lula, a hairdresser on 137th Street, cooked it every Saturday in a black cast iron pot. Smoked bacon rendered first, then onion, green pepper, a crushed garlic clove. In went a cup of rice and 2 cups of tomato broth made from the cheap can of crushed tomatoes you could buy for 9 cents. Salt, a dash of red pepper, a tight lid, and 20 minutes on low heat. The rice came out brick red, glossy, each grain separate. Lula said you could hear Charleston in every spoonful. That is a migration told through a single pot. Back then, a quart of red rice fed 8 grown people after a long laundry shift. Marinating meat in buttermilk was a technique African American cooks used to transform tough, inexpensive cuts into tender meals that rivaled expensive steaks. Food scientists now understand that buttermilk's lactic acid gently breaks down muscle fibers without turning meat mushy, while calcium helps proteins retain moisture during cooking. Research confirms that buttermilk marinades penetrate deeper than vinegar, creating tenderness throughout rather than just on the surface. Grandmothers would submerge chicken pieces overnight before dredging in seasoned flour, producing fried chicken so tender it fell off the bone. What seemed like folk wisdom was precise food chemistry that restaurants now employ deliberately. Black cooks mastered meat tenderization through observation long before laboratories confirmed their methods. Fermenting vegetables at home was viewed as risky preservation that could cause illness, yet African American cooks kept crocks of fermenting produce that provided nutrition through winter months. Scientists now champion fermentation as one of the most health-promoting traditions, producing probiotics that support gut health and immune function. Research confirms that fermented vegetables contain higher vitamin levels than fresh counterparts while being easier to digest. Grandmothers made chow chow, pickled peppers, and sauerkraut using techniques passed down through generations. The process required no special equipment, just salt, time, and knowledge families preserved through practice. What modern food safety tried to discourage, health science now celebrates as traditional wisdom worth reviving. A single smoked ham hock could flavor a pot big enough to feed 8 people for 2 days. That was the trick, born out of necessity so deep it became philosophy. Meat was expensive. Beans, rice, and greens were not. So the meat became a seasoning agent rather than the center of the plate, dropping its smoke and salt and fat into whatever surrounded it, while the cheaper ingredients did the heavy work. A piece of salt pork the size of a deck of cards could transform a bland pot of pinto beans into something rich and layered. A few strips of bacon rendered at the bottom of a Dutch oven became the base for cabbage that tasted like it had been cooking for a lifetime. Women who could not afford a roast every week still put meals on the table that tasted like abundance because they understood that flavor does not require volume. A little pork, a lot of patience, and a heavy lid could feed a household and leave everyone quiet and full. The secret was a teaspoon of white vinegar worked into the dough just before the water went in, and most people who hadn't grown up in these kitchens had never heard of it. The chemistry is straightforward. Gluten develops when flour proteins are hydrated and agitated, and gluten is what makes pastry tough rather than flaky. Vinegar is a mild acid, and acid inhibits gluten formation, meaning a small amount added to pie dough actively resists the toughening that handling usually causes. African American bakers in the South incorporated this by at least the 1930s and 40s, passed down through women who made pies from scratch every week and had figured out by feel what the science would later confirm. Some combined the vinegar with a tablespoon of ice-cold vodka for an even more tender crust. Alcohol inhibits gluten even more aggressively than acid alone, and it evaporates cleanly in the oven without leaving flavor behind. You didn't need to understand any of that. You just needed to have watched someone do it once.
Ash-roasted sweet potatoes were one of the simplest yet most beloved tricks, cooked directly in the coals of an outdoor fire. Families placed whole sweet potatoes under hot ash, letting them roast slowly until their skins blackened and their insides caramelized. The result was tender, smoky, and sweet, needing no sugar or butter to taste indulgent. Children pulled them from the ashes with excitement, blowing off the dust to reveal steaming orange flesh. For many, they were both snack and supper, eaten hot in the yard after long days of work. The trick required no pots, pans, or seasoning, just fire and patience. Ash-roasted sweet potatoes symbolized how resourcefulness could turn the simplest crop into comfort. They were food of the land, as pure as it came, connecting families to earth and fire. Today, they are almost forgotten, replaced by oven-baked versions. Yet the memory of pulling sweetness from ashes lingers as a testament to survival and tradition, wrapped in smoky warmth.
Number 9, frying hoe cakes thin on a flat griddle. Not every cornbread came out of a deep pan, and the flattest one carried the heaviest history. A thin batter of meal, salt, and water was spooned onto a hot greased griddle and fried like a pancake, crisp at the lacy edges and tender in the middle, flipped once and eaten hot off the iron. The name tells you where it began. Enslaved field hands cooked these cakes on the blade of a garden hoe held over the coals, because a hoe was the only flat metal surface they were given out in the fields. That story of cooking supper on a farming tool has carried down through generations as a mark of endurance and plain ingenuity under cruelty. The cakes drew on griddle traditions enslaved Africans carried with them, breads made from ground millet and sorghum back home that adapted easily once cornmeal became the grain most within reach in the American South. A hoe cake needed no oven and no waiting, which made it the perfect bread for people who had neither time nor tools to spare. It cooked in minutes, stretched a fistful of meal into a meal, and tasted of corn and hot grease and nothing else. Heat the griddle, spoon it thin, and flip when the edges go lace. Number 17, burying vegetables in sand. Sweet potatoes, turnips, and beets were layered in wooden crates with damp sand between each row, then stored in a root cellar or buried in a pit dug into the earth. The sand held just enough moisture to prevent shriveling, but not enough to encourage rot. It worked like a thermostat made of earth. Your family could pull fresh vegetables from that crate in February that had been buried since October. They tasted almost as fresh as the day they went into the ground. County agents called it unsanitary because soil contact could introduce bacteria. But the sand was not soil. It was a humidity control system, as precise in its own way as a walk-in cooler. Modern cold storage facilities use the same principle, controlled humidity between 85 and 95% at temperatures just above freezing. A hole in the ground in Georgia maintained roughly those conditions from November through March without a single kilowatt of electricity. Number 14, saving cake batter from curdling with a warm bowl. The coldest months of winter were the hardest on a pound cake because cold butter and cold eggs refused to come together into smooth batter. Big Mama solved the problem with a kettle of warm water and a metal mixing bowl. She would fill the kettle, pour the warm water into the bottom of the sink, and sit the empty metal bowl in the water for 2 or 3 minutes before she began creaming the butter and sugar. The bowl came out warm to the touch, just shy of body temperature, which was enough to keep the butter soft as she worked. When the eggs went in one at a time, they did not seize the butter into a curdled mess. The batter stayed silky from start to finish, and the cake came out of the oven with the close, tender crumb that made her pound cakes famous at every funeral, wedding, and Sunday dinner from October through March. Cold kitchen, warm bowl, smooth batter, 3 steps, 1 rule. Number 17, making 1 chicken, feed the family 3 separate meals. The first meal was the roasted bird itself, served on a Sunday after church with rice and gravy. Whatever meat was left on the bones after dinner went into a pot of water with onion ends, a few peppercorns, and whatever celery tops or carrot stubs were in the icebox. That became stock, and the stock became Monday's soup. By Tuesday, the last scraps of meat picked off the carcass were folded into rice or stirred into a thick gravy and served over biscuits. 3 full meals from 1 animal. The bones went into the garden as fertilizer. The fat was skimmed off the soup and saved for the grease jar. A single chicken, bought at the right price or raised in the backyard, could carry a family nearly halfway through the week if the woman cooking knew how to think 3 meals ahead. Stretching meat with oatmeal was how Black grandmothers fed large families when budgets were tight and mouths were many. When making meatloaf, meatballs, or hamburger patties, Grandma mixed oatmeal directly into ground beef, sometimes adding as much filler as meat. The oats absorb meat juices during cooking, staying moist and flavorful, while adding bulk-making portions go further. Children never noticed because texture blended seamlessly and oatmeal actually bound everything together better than breadcrumbs. This trick meant 1 pound of meat could feed twice as many people, a miracle born from necessity and perfected through practice. Grandma understood protein was expensive and creativity was free, combining both to keep her family nourished. Applying mayonnaise to remove water stains from wooden furniture was an African-American remedy that furniture experts now endorse. Grandmothers would spread mayonnaise over white rings left by wet glasses, cover with cloth, and let it sit overnight, revealing restored wood by morning. Food scientists understand that mayonnaise's combination of oil and vinegar penetrates wood grain, rehydrating dried fibers, while mild acid dissolves mineral deposits. This technique saved countless tables from permanent damage without expensive refinishing. The hack required only pantry staples and patience, making it accessible to any household. Women passed this knowledge through generations, rescuing precious furniture that represented significant family investments. Number 14, leftover roast with pan gravy. Sunday dinner in a white household centered on a large roast, beef, pork, or sometimes a hen. The family ate the prime cuts at the dining table, and what remained went to the kitchen. The end pieces, too small or too tough for a second serving, belonged to the cook. She sliced them thin and covered them in gravy made from the drippings left in the roasting pan. Drippings, flour, water, salt, stirred over heat until it thickened. The flavor carried everything the roast had released during hours of cooking. Every herb, every onion, every clove of garlic that had surrounded the meat transferred into that gravy. A domestic worker eating leftover roast with pan gravy was eating the concentrated essence of a meal she had spent the morning preparing for someone else. The leftovers carried home in the pan tote fed Monday and sometimes Tuesday, cold sliced roast on bread, gravy reheated over rice. The meat stretched further than anyone in the dining room imagined because stretching food was a skill the dining room never needed to learn. In some households, the cook received the pan tote openly. In others, she packed the pan quietly after the family left the kitchen. The difference depended entirely on the temperament of the employer. Some counted the leftover slices, some never looked. Either way, the calculus was the same. A woman who cooked a roast all morning took home enough meat to feed her children and called it even. The roast was never hers, but the knowledge of how to make it last was something no employer could claim. That knowledge passed from mother to daughter without a recipe card. How to slice against the grain so tough meat stayed chewable. How much water to add to gravy to stretch it without making it thin. These were calculations performed daily, silently, without credit. Number 23, fried cornmeal mush. Leftover grits from Tuesday did not get thrown away in a Harlem kitchen. Ever. Corrine poured the thick mush into a loaf pan and left it on the fire escape overnight to set. By morning, it was firm enough to slice. She cut the loaf into thick slabs, dredged them in dry meal, and fried them in fatback grease until the edges went gold and lacy. A drizzle of cane syrup on top, and that was breakfast for 4. The whole plate cost maybe 6 cents. Her father had eaten the same breakfast on a tenant farm in Sumter County decades earlier. He called it yesterday's supper, showing up for work again. That is frugality passed down through 3 generations. The kind of cooking your grandmother did not write down because nobody thought to ask. Using every part of vegetables was seen as desperate poverty. Cooking by those who discarded carrot tops, beet greens, and turnip leaves without a second thought. African American cooks knew those parts contained nutrition that grocery stores trained people to throw away. Scientists now confirm that vegetable tops often contain higher concentrations of vitamins and minerals than the roots they grow from. Beet greens provide more iron than the beets themselves. Carrot tops offer compounds that support liver function. Turnip greens deliver calcium, rivaling dairy products. Grandmothers washed and cooked these tops alongside their vegetables, stretching resources while maximizing nutrition. What seemed like making do with scraps was actually whole food eating that modern nutritionists now champion as optimal. Ham hock and turnip greens carried tradition in every slow-simmered pot, filling homes with smoky aroma that signaled Sunday dinner was near. Grandmothers washed turnip greens several times to remove grit, then added them to pots with smoked ham hocks, onions, and a splash of vinegar. The greens simmered for hours until silky and tender, absorbing the rich, salty essence of the pork. The pot liquor left behind was liquid gold, sipped from cups or sopped with cornbread to capture every drop. Ham hocks were affordable cuts that butchers sold cheaply, perfect for stretching meals across large families. The meat fell off the bone by cooking's end, offering protein alongside vegetables in one nourishing pot. This dish taught children that patience and humble ingredients created meals worth waiting for. Nobody who grew up in one of these kitchens ever saw a measuring cup used for measuring. A palm of flour, a pour of buttermilk that looked right against the bowl, a pinch of salt tested between two fingers. This was precision of a different kind, built over years of baking the same things in the same cast iron until the hands knew more than any card could say. In West African culinary tradition, cooking by ratio and feel rather than fixed measurement was standard practice for centuries, and it traveled with the Great Migration into northern kitchens that had never heard of it. The trick is understanding relationships, not amounts. More fat means more tenderness, more acid means more rise. The women who never needed to write anything down had memorized chemistry without calling it that, and if you were lucky enough to stand beside one long enough, she handed you something no recipe card can hold.
Wild persimmon bread carried the sweetness of the land itself, made from fruit gathered by hand in the fall. Families waited until the persimmons were soft and ripe, their astringency gone, then mashed the pulp into batter with flour, eggs, and spices. The bread baked into loaves that were dense, fragrant, and naturally sweet. Foraging for persimmons was a seasonal ritual, with children climbing trees and filling baskets under the autumn sun. The fruit was free, abundant, and full of vitamins, making it a precious resource when money for sugar or store-bought sweets was scarce. Wild persimmon bread tasted like the season, a warm reminder that even hard times could offer comfort. It often appeared on holiday tables, stretching humble ingredients into a dish that felt special. Today, it is nearly forgotten, overshadowed by modern quick breads like banana bread. Yet the memory of wild persimmon bread connects us to resourcefulness, tradition, and the joy of turning foraged fruit into nourishment. Each slice told the story of making the most of what nature gave.
Number 6, mixing fine and coarse cornmeal for texture. The finest cooks did not trust a single grind to do the whole job. They blended 2 meals in the bowl, a fine, soft grind for a tender crumb and a coarse, gritty grind for backbone and crunch. The fine meal drank up the buttermilk and bound everything smooth, while the coarse meal kept its tooth even after baking, scattering little pockets of crisp grit through every slice. That mix gave the bread 2 textures at once, soft and substantial in the same bite instead of the dull sameness of one grind alone. It came naturally from stone milling, where the same batch of corn produced both fine flour and rough grit, and a thrifty cook simply used all of it rather than sifting any away. Because stone grinding kept the whole kernel, oil, germ, and bran together, that mix of grinds also carried more corn flavor than the powdery, degerminated meal sold in sacks later on. Nothing got thrown out, and the bread was better for it. The coarse grains also held moisture and gave the crumbs something to lean on, so the loaf stayed sturdy enough to soak up gravy without going to mush. Blend the fine and the coarse, and the bread eats like two breads in one. Number 16, cane syrup preserving. In the sugarcane belt of Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, Black families poured thick cane syrup over fruits and sometimes meats to preserve them. The syrup's sugar concentration was so high that it pulled water out of any bacteria that landed on the surface, killing them through osmotic pressure. The same principle makes honey one of the only foods that never spoils. Nutritionists in the 20th century dismissed syrup preservation as nothing more than candy making and warned it was too high in sugar to be considered a legitimate food safety practice. But osmotic preservation is now a recognized method in food science. The sugar concentration in cane syrup exceeds 60%, which is well above the threshold needed to prevent microbial growth. Those families were practicing the same science that keeps your store-bought jam safe on the shelf for years. The jar was different, the chemistry was identical. Number 15, salt brine, fish preservation. Along the rivers and coastlines of the South, Black families caught more fish than they could eat in a single day. Catfish, bream, crappie, whatever the river offered. But without refrigeration, fish spoiled faster than almost any other food. So the surplus went into a crock of heavily salted water, packed tight with enough salt to make the brine feel thick on your fingers. The brine penetrated the flesh and dropped the water activity to a level where spoilage organisms could not survive. When your family needed protein, you pulled a piece from the brine, soaked it in fresh water to draw out the excess salt, and cooked it as if it had come straight from the river. Fried saltfish with grits and onions was a breakfast that fed families along the Carolina coast for generations. Regulators said home brining was inconsistent and risky. Modern food scientists confirmed that salt concentrations above 10% effectively halt bacterial growth. The women who packed fish in crocks every summer did not measure water activity. They tasted the brine. If it was salty enough to pucker your lips, it was salty enough to keep the fish safe. The tongue was their instrument. Number 20, stretching tough cuts of meat with buttermilk overnight. When the round steak was the cheap kind, the kind that could turn into shoe leather under the wrong hand, Big Mama reached for the buttermilk crock. She would lay the meat flat in a deep bowl, pour cold buttermilk over the top until the steak was fully covered, and slide the bowl into the icebox before she went to bed. The next morning, the same cut that would have fought a fork the night before was relaxed and pliable, ready to be breaded and pan-fried into chicken-fried steak that you could cut with the edge of a butter knife. The trick is lactic acid. The mild acid in cultured buttermilk slowly breaks down tough muscle fibers without ever turning the surface mushy the way stronger acids will. Vinegar moves too fast, wine moves too sharp. Buttermilk moves the speed of grandmother time, slow and patient and gentle, which was exactly the right speed for cheap meat and a house full of mouths to feed by morning. Nothing else worked as well, and she always had a quart of buttermilk on hand for biscuits anyway. Number 13, rendering leftover fat into homemade soap. Store-bought soap was an expense that a resourceful grandmother could eliminate entirely. Leftover cooking grease, the old drippings, too dark or too stale to reuse for food, got combined with lye in a heavy pot set up outdoors. The mixture was stirred slowly, poured into shallow wooden molds or a lined pan, and left to harden in the air. What came out was a hard bar of lye soap that cleaned dishes, scrubbed floors, washed clothes on the washboard, and bathed the children on Saturday night. One batch lasted the household for weeks. The process smelled terrible and had to be done outside, but the savings were real and immediate. Every dollar not spent on soap was a dollar freed up for flour, sugar, coffee, or salt. Every grandmother on this list understood something that modern budgeting advice still has not figured out. The grocery bill was never just about food. It was about everything the kitchen touched: soap, rags, clothes for the children, seasoning, sweetener, medicine from the garden. A Depression-era Black grandmother did not draw lines between these categories the way a modern household budget does. She ran the kitchen like a small production line where nothing left is waste and everything that came in served at least two purposes. The flour fed the family and dressed the children. The grease cooked the meals and cleaned the house. The garden grew dinner and funded trades with the neighbors. The chicken gave 3 meals and then fertilized the soil that grew next season's greens. This is not nostalgia. This is systems thinking, practiced by women who never heard the term but lived it every single day. Reviving stale bread with water and heat was how Black grandmothers refused to let anything go to waste in their kitchens. When a loaf had gone past its prime, dry and crumbly where it once was soft, Grandma ran it quickly under the faucet, getting the crust damp but not soaked through. She placed the moistened loaf directly in a hot oven for just a few minutes, watching carefully. Steam regenerated inside the bread, rehydrating starches that had gone hard and crusty. The result was bread tasting nearly fresh, with crisp crust and soft interior that seemed impossible given its previous state. This trick saved money and prevented waste, values Grandma held sacred after surviving times when food was never guaranteed. The revived bread made perfect toast or bread pudding. Using onion halves to absorb paint fumes was an African-American household trick that painters now recommend. When fresh paint made rooms unbearable, grandmothers would cut onions in half and place them around the space, somehow neutralizing the harsh chemical smell within hours. Scientists have confirmed that onions contain sulfur compounds that bind with volatile organic compounds released by paint, effectively removing them from the air. The onions would turn dark as they absorb toxins, serving as visual proof of their effectiveness. This hack was particularly important in homes without air conditioning, where opening windows wasn't always practical during hot summers or cold winters. Women protected their families from harmful fumes using nothing but vegetables from their kitchens. Number 21, fried leftover rice. White families in the 1940s. South ate rice as a side dish and rarely finished the pot. The remaining rice sat overnight and hardened by morning. Domestic workers scraped it into a hot skillet with bacon grease and fried it until the edges turned golden and crisp. Sometimes a cracked egg went in. Sometimes nothing but salt. Fried rice made from yesterday's pot was common across the Gulf Coast, from Mobile to New Orleans, where rice was a staple in nearly every household. A cold clump of leftover rice dropped into sizzling fat transformed from a throwaway into something worth eating. It filled a plate, it asked for nothing, and it used an ingredient the family had already forgotten about by the time they sat down for breakfast. There is something worth saying plainly about how these kitchens worked. In the 1940s, white household in the American South, a Black domestic worker cooked every meal. She chose the seasonings, watched the pot, knew when the roast was done by the sound it made. She fed the family 3 times a day, and then she ate separately, sometimes at the kitchen table after the family finished, sometimes standing at the counter, sometimes not at all until she got home. This was not accidental, it was architecture. The dining room had one door that swung into the kitchen, and that door was a border. The food was the same food, cooked by the same hands, seasoned by the same knowledge. But the plates were different, the chairs were different, the time of eating was different. The food was never just food, it was a measure of where you were allowed to sit. Number 15, slumgullion stretch stew. Slumgullion was the word for whatever you had. In Corin's pot, that meant a cup of leftover rice, a handful of chopped onion, 2 cold pork chops, diced small, a can of tomatoes, and a dash of hot sauce. Everything simmered together for 30 minutes until the rice swelled and the whole pot smelled like Sunday. The name was a joke. The meal was serious. A laundress with 3 boarders and 22 cents in her apron pocket could feed everyone on slumgullion, and no one would walk away hungry. What I noticed reading old Harlem papers is how often the word turned up in women's columns. Slumgullion was code for stretching a paycheck to the next Friday. Generations of women did it. The best kind of cheap cooking there ever was. Letting batter rest before frying was a step many modern cooks skip. Yet, African American grandmothers insisted the weight made all the difference in crunch and texture. Food scientists now confirm that resting allows gluten strands to relax, starches to hydrate fully, and air bubbles to stabilize, creating lighter, crispier coatings. Research shows rested batters absorb less oil during frying because their structure is more cohesive. Grandmothers would mix their cornmeal coating, then attend to other kitchen tasks while the mixture transformed. The resulting fried chicken and catfish emerged with crust that shattered between teeth rather than turning soggy. What seemed like patience forced by busy kitchens was deliberate technique that improved texture and reduced oil absorption.
Grape hull pie was an ingenious way to waste nothing, even after grapes had been pressed for juice or wine. The thick, chewy skins were simmered with sugar and spices, then baked into a pie with a flaky crust. The result was a dessert that was both tart and sweet, carrying the full essence of the grape. For many households, it meant stretching a harvest further, ensuring no part of the fruit was discarded. Children who expected jelly were surprised to find grape skins tucked into pies, yet grew to love their unique flavor. Grape hull pie was common in homesteads where every scrap counted, reflecting a deep respect for the land's bounty. It represented a kind of cooking where thrift and creativity merged, transforming leftovers into tradition. Today, it is rarely seen outside of heritage cookbooks, nearly erased by modern preferences. Yet grape hull pie reminds us of the cleverness of past kitchens where nothing was wasted and every bite carried the flavor of ingenuity.
The grease was spitting and someone was about to get burned, and then she reached for the salt. A generous shake of table salt scattered across the bottom of the skillet before the meat went in, and the popping slowed to almost nothing. The salt absorbed the moisture caused the oil to erupt, pulling the water out of the surface of the pan and keeping the fat calm enough to do its work without launching tiny missiles across the kitchen. This trick predated splatter screens and was cheaper than any gadget. In the 1950s and 60s, when a Saturday fish fry meant standing over a deep pot of oil for an hour, a handful of salt in the bottom could mean the difference between a peaceful kitchen and a trip to the sink with a burned forearm. Nobody wrote it down because everybody already knew. You salted the pan first, you dried your meat with a towel, and you kept your face back when the first piece went in. No buttermilk meant a 10-second fix. You took whatever milk was left, poured a cup, added a tablespoon of white vinegar or lemon juice, stirred it twice, and let it sit for 5 minutes. What came back was close enough in chemistry to do the job. The acid had begun curdling the milk protein slightly, creating the tangy consistency that activates baking soda the way true buttermilk does. The acid-base reaction between buttermilk and baking soda is what produces the rise in quick breads. Carbon dioxide bubbles from chemistry, not just heat. African American bakers in the rural South, especially during the 1940s and 50s, when fresh buttermilk wasn't always available, knew this substitution by instinct. They didn't need a food chemistry textbook. They needed biscuits on the table by 6 in the morning, and the vinegar trick made that possible with whatever was left in the house. The
Hog crackling gravy was a trick to bring bold flavor to otherwise plain meals of rice, potatoes, or cornbread. Cracklings, the crispy bits left from rendering pork fat, were stirred into pan drippings and flour to make a rich, textured gravy. The salty crunch of the cracklings turned a simple starch into something hearty and satisfying. Families loved it because it stretched scraps into abundance, proving that nothing from the hog was wasted. It was often poured over large bowls of rice, transforming the cheapest ingredient into a meal fit for a feast. Children scooped it eagerly, not realizing they were eating thrift disguised as indulgence. The gravy carried the smoky, savory essence of pork, a taste that defined many kitchens of the South. Today, hog crackling gravy is nearly forgotten, replaced by smoother gravies with no trace of grit. Yet in its time, it embodied the art of survival cooking, where resourcefulness brought joy to the table. Hog crackling gravy was poverty made flavorful.
Number 16, pouring the batter into hot fat for the sizzle ring. There is a sound a good cook waits for, and this trick is built around it. Before the batter ever went in, a spoonful of lard or bacon grease was dropped into the already screaming pan and swirled until it shimmered and nearly smoked. The grease had to be hot enough to ripple, almost ready to burn. When the batter hit that pool of fat, it sizzled around the rim and climbed the sides, frying the outer edge while the center baked. That gave the loaf a crisp lacquered ring all the way around, the part everybody fought over at the table. The fat also greased the pan so the bread lifted out whole, never tearing or sticking to the iron. Skip this step and the batter just sat there, soaking instead of searing, and the edges came out soft and pale. The hot fat pour was the difference between plain cornbread and the kind people remembered. It cost almost nothing, just a spoon of grease and a little nerve to let the pan get that hot. Drop the fat in first and listen for the sizzle before you pour. Number 15, letting baking soda and buttermilk do the lifting. Old cooks did not trust a tall stack of leavening, and they did not need it. A pinch of soda stirred into the meal, then met with sour buttermilk, set off a quiet chemical rise the moment the two touched. The acid in the buttermilk and the soda fizzed against each other, lifting the crumb just enough to keep it tender without turning it into spongy cake. That is why the batter went into the hot pan fast, before the bubbles could fade and flatten. Wait too long and the rise was gone, leaving a dense, heavy bread that sat in your stomach like a stone. Some hands used a little baking powder too, but the buttermilk and soda pairing was the older way, learned back when store leavening was dear, and a careful cook stretched every spoonful she had. It also balanced the sour, since the soda took the sharp edge off the tang and left the clean corn flavor behind. The whole reaction cost a pinch of powder and a moment's attention. Stir the soda into the meal, then move quick. Number 21, vinegar pepper sauce. Every kitchen table in the Black South had a bottle of vinegar with hot peppers floating inside. It was not a condiment, it was a preservation system disguised as a table sauce. The peppers released capsaicin into the vinegar over time, creating a solution with both antimicrobial and antioxidant properties. You shook it over greens, beans, rice, or anything that needed brightening. When the vinegar ran low, you poured more in. The same peppers lasted for months, sometimes years. Some families passed the same bottle down through an entire growing season, refilling it the way you top off a gas tank. Food safety officials warned against storing peppers in vinegar at room temperature because the pH might not be low enough to prevent botulism. But vinegar sits at a pH between 2.4 and 3.4, well below the 4.6 threshold where Clostridium botulinum can grow. The science was on your grandmother's side the entire time. She just never got the credit. Number 11, peeling a head of garlic with the flat of a heavy blade. The paper skin on a clove of garlic was no match for the broadside of Big Mama's chef knife. She would break the head apart with the heel of her hand, lay a single clove on the wooden board, set the wide flat of the blade across it, and bring the side of her fist down on the steel with one quick controlled tap. The papery hull split open and slid right off in one piece, and the bruised clove inside was already half prepped for the chopping board. A whole head went from intact to peeled in under a minute, with no fingernails ruined and no sticky little flakes clinging to everything. The smashed clove gave up its oil faster too, so the gravy or the gumbo picked up flavor in half the time. The flat of the knife did the work of 3 gadgets and never broke down. Number 12, buying day-old bread at half the price. Fresh bread was for families that did not have to count every penny. A grandmother who knew her local baker or her corner store knew exactly when yesterday's loaves moved to the discount shelf, and she was there before anyone else. Day-old bread made the same toast, the same croutons for soup, the same bread pudding. Crumbled into meatloaf, nobody could taste the difference. Soaked in egg and fried in a hot skillet with a little grease, it became French toast for the children. The bread was never wasted at any stage of its life. Fresh, it was bread. Stale, it was an ingredient. Past stale, it was dried crumbs in a jar. Past crumbs, it went to the chickens in the yard. Adding a potato to oversalted dishes was emergency rescue wisdom that saved countless pots of soup, stew, and greens from the trash can. When Grandma's hand slipped with the salt shaker or the smoked meat released more brine than expected, she didn't panic. She peeled a raw potato, cut it into chunks, and dropped it directly into the simmering pot. The potato absorbed excess salt as it cooked, pulling the seasoning out of the liquid and into its starchy flesh. After 20 minutes or so, she fished out the potato pieces and discarded them, leaving behind a dish that tasted balanced again. This trick worked because potatoes were always available and cheap, making them the perfect sacrifice for saving an expensive pot of food. It was practical magic that every grandmother seemed to know instinctively. Placing a wooden spoon across boiling pots to prevent overflow was a technique every African-American grandmother seemed to know instinctively. When pasta water or milk threatened to bubble over, laying a wooden spoon across the pot's rim would mysteriously calm the foam. Food scientists have since explained that wood's dry surface destabilizes bubbles on contact, while the spoon's temperature causes rapid bubble collapse. This hack saved countless stovetops from sticky messes and allowed multitasking cooks to attend other duties without constant watching. Grandmothers would position their spoons and turn to other tasks, confident their pots would behave. Children watched this seeming magic and learned that traditional knowledge often outpaced scientific understanding. Number 20, chicken backs and gizzards. When the family ate fried chicken, the breasts, thighs, and drumsticks went to the dining room table. The backs, gizzards, hearts, and necks stayed in the kitchen. A chicken back has almost no meat. What it has is flavor. Slow cooked with an onion and a bay leaf, the back released a broth darker and richer than anything made from a breast. Gizzards needed long cooking to soften their tough muscle. Sliced thin and fried, They turned chewy and savory. Domestic workers learned to prefer these pieces, not because they chose to, but because preference grew from what was available. After years of eating the back became the piece you reach for first. That is how preference works when you have no say in the matter. Number 18, fried sweet potato slices. Imagine the cheapest side dish in all of Harlem. A single sweet potato cost 2 cents on 135th Street. Corrine peeled it, sliced it thin as a dime, and fried the rounds in bacon grease until the edges caramelized into a kind of crunchy candy. A sprinkle of salt, a shake of cinnamon, and that was a side that went with anything. Pork chops, chicken, neck bones, greens. The sweetness cut through the salt the way a singer cuts through a noisy room. It was beautiful cooking made from nothing. And here's the part that surprised me when I dug into the research. Fried sweet potato slices were not a southern dish transplanted. They were invented in the northern kitchens up in Harlem and Pittsburgh and Detroit by women who arrived with nothing but a cast iron pan and a memory of their mother's garden. They adapted. They made sweetness work in a kitchen 6 feet wide. Corrine taught the same trick to her landlady's daughter, a girl of 12 named Hazel, who was born in New York and had never seen a sweet potato pulled from red dirt. Hazel would cook them the same way for her own children in the 1950s and her grandchildren in the 1980s. That is how a recipe survives the war, the depression, and 2 generations of moving trucks. 1 cast iron pan, 1 thin slice, 1 cheap sweet potato that became a part of who the family was. Every time you smell that caramel edge coming up from the grease, you are standing in a chain that runs back to a laundress on Sugar Hill in 1928. That is not nostalgia. That is a working woman's gift to a century she would never see. Using bacon grease as cooking fat was condemned for decades as unhealthy habit that would clog arteries. Yet African American cooks never stopped saving every precious drop. Modern research reveals that rendered pork fat contains less saturated fat than butter and provides stable cooking temperatures that prevent harmful compounds created when vegetable oils break down. Scientists discovered that animal fats contain fat-soluble vitamins processed oils lack entirely. Grandmothers kept ceramic crocks by the stove, straining bacon, drippings for seasoning vegetables and frying eggs. What nutritionists once banned as dangerous, researchers now acknowledge as traditional wisdom that understood fat quality matters more than fat avoidance. That humble grease jar held more intelligence than years of misguided dietary advice.
Slab bacon. Grease cookies were a sweet born out of thrift, when butter was scarce and nothing could be wasted. Families saved every drop of bacon grease in jars, using it not only for frying, but also for baking. When mixed into cookie dough with sugar, flour, and spices, the grease gave the cookies a unique smoky richness. They were soft, slightly salty, and filled with the taste of survival, proof that ingenuity could transform scraps into something special. Children often ate them warm from the oven, unaware they were built on frugality rather than luxury. These cookies carried the story of resilience, turning what others might discard into dessert. They were common in households where bacon was a rare indulgence, stretching its value far beyond breakfast. The smell of these cookies baking lingered in kitchens, a blend of sweet and savory unlike anything from store-bought treats. Today, they are nearly vanished, their memory tied to hard times. Slab bacon grease cookies show how even hardship can leave behind flavors worth remembering.
Sounds like superstition, and maybe part of it was, but the copper penny dropped into a pot of collard greens showed up in kitchens from rural Georgia to the south side of Chicago. The idea was simple. Copper helped the greens hold their color during the long, slow cook, keeping them from turning that dull olive brown that made even the best pot look tired. Old pennies, the ones minted before 1982 when they were still 95% copper, worked best. Some women used a clean copper nail instead. The chemistry involved copper ions interacting with chlorophyll, stabilizing the green pigment against the acid released during cooking. But that explanation came decades later from food scientists who had finally caught up to what these women already knew. The penny came out before serving, rinsed and dropped back into the junk drawer until the next pot. It was a small trick, nearly invisible, but the greens that emerged were as vivid as the day they were picked. You never boiled them for pie. That rule was absolute and didn't need explaining. Boiling sweet potatoes for custard filling pulls water into the flesh. The potato becomes waterlogged, and no amount of oven time drives all that moisture back out. What you get is a filling that runs, a crust that absorbs liquid from below, a texture closer to puree than set custard. But roasted whole in a dry oven, pierced with a fork and left at high heat, the natural sugars caramelize inside the skin as water evaporates, the flesh concentrates, and the flavor shifts from plain sweet to something honeyed and slightly smoky at the edges. African American cooks across the Southeast held this distinction for generations, roasted for pies, boiled for savory dishes, choosing the jewel or garnet varieties for their dense orange flesh and high sugar content. You knew they were ready when the skin had tightened and split, and a slow dark drip of caramelized syrup had pooled on the pan below. If the sweet potato demanded patience,
wild blackberry syrup was a way to capture the taste of summer, made from berries picked along fence rows and country paths. Families gathered buckets of ripe blackberries, boiled them with sugar, and reduced the juice into a thick, tangy syrup. It was poured over flapjacks, biscuits, or even cornbread, making simple meals feel luxurious. Children enjoyed the berry picking as much as the syrup, coming home with stained hands and lips. Adults treasured the syrup for its ability to preserve summer sweetness through the cold months. For many households, it represented both resourcefulness and abundance, turning wild fruit into lasting comfort. Sharing jars with neighbors reinforced community bonds, making it more than just food. Today, blackberry syrup has almost vanished from kitchens, replaced by mass-produced bottles. Its loss reflects a decline in foraging traditions and seasonal cooking. Yet wild blackberry syrup was more than a condiment. It was a piece of summer captured in a jar. Forgotten now, it once brightened even the humblest of meals.
Number 11, folding pork cracklings into crackling bread. When there was pork to spare, plain cornbread got a glorious upgrade. After lard was rendered down, the crisp little bits of fried fat and skin left behind were called cracklings, and a cook folded a generous handful of them right into the batter. They baked up into crunchy, salty, smoky nuggets all through the bread, turning a humble loaf into something close to a feast. Crackling bread has a long and heavy history behind it. It was eaten in the cabins of enslaved people, made from the scraps and renderings left after the better cuts of the hog were taken away to the big house, and black cooks learned to coax real richness out of even those leftovers. The cracklings themselves came from the hog killing, when the men rendered the fat down in a great black wash pot, and the crisp bits left behind were divided among everyone who helped with the day's hard work. Out of that hardship came a bread so good it outlived the cruelty that shaped it, and it still shows up proudly at our Southern tables today, in cookbooks and at church suppers alike. Nothing on a hog was ever wasted, not the fat, not the skin, not a scrap, and crackling bread proved it better than anything. The crunch of pork worked through warm cornbread was a small, hard-earned luxury pulled from what others threw out. Save your cracklings and fold them in for the richest bread of all. Number 23, lard sealing. After rendering hog fat over a low fire until it turned white and clean, your grandmother poured that liquid lard over cooked meats in a crock until the fat covered every surface by at least an inch. When the lard cooled and solidified, it created an airtight seal like a wax lid that no bacteria could penetrate. The meat stayed preserved for months in a root cellar without any refrigeration at all. Families in the Delta kept crocks of lard-sealed pork in their cellars all winter. Health officials in the 1950s called this method dangerous and unsanitary. Modern food science tells a different story. Rendered lard, stored in a cool environment, creates an anaerobic barrier that prevents oxidation and microbial growth. French chefs call this technique confit and charge you $40 a plate. Black women in Mississippi called it putting up meat and charged nothing. Today's gourmet is yesterday's survival. Number 17, saving the pot liquor for the next day's soup. The dark broth left in the bottom of the greens pot was never thrown out in Big Mama's kitchen. It was the foundation of tomorrow's supper. She would ladle the pot liquor into a clean glass jar, screw the lid down tight, and set it on the cold shelf of the icebox. The next afternoon, that same jar became the cooking liquid for a pot of rice, or the simmering base for a quick pan of dumplings, or the soup itself if the cornbread held out. The liquid carried every bit of flavor that had cooked out of the greens and the smoked meat, along with most of the water-soluble vitamins, which is why pot liquor was prescribed by Southern doctors during the Depression for anemic children. Big Mama saved it because the alternative was pouring grocery money down the drain, and she had never poured grocery money anywhere but into the pot. 1 pound of greens fed the family twice, and the second meal was usually the better one because the flavor had a night to settle and deepen. Number 5, replacing store-bought white sugar with sorghum syrup and molasses. Granulated sugar was a manufactured product with a manufactured price. Sorghum syrup, pressed from cane stalks grown on local farms, was cheap to buy and sometimes free if the family knew someone who operated a mill. Molasses was a byproduct of sugar refining and sold for next to nothing at country stores. Grandmothers used them for everything sweet, poured over hot biscuits in the morning, stirred into a bowl of oatmeal, baked into gingerbread, cookies, and sweet potato pie, mixed with hot water for a warm drink when coffee ran out. The flavor was darker, richer, and more complex than white sugar ever was. The switch saved real money across every week of the year, and plenty of families never switched back. Number 4, maintaining one cast iron skillet for every cooking job in the house. Preventing curdled custard with cornstarch was Grandma's insurance policy against dessert disasters that could ruin Sunday dinner. Custards, puddings, and pie fillings made with eggs had a tendency to curdle if heat got too high or stirring stopped for even a moment. Grandma's solution was adding a small spoonful of cornstarch to the egg mixture before cooking, which stabilized the proteins and gave her more forgiveness at the stove. This meant she could focus on other dishes without panicking about her banana pudding separating into a grainy mess. The cornstarch created a smoother, silkier texture that held together even when reheated. Children never knew why Grandma's custard was always perfect while others failed, but this simple trick was the secret. It turned a temperamental technique into something reliable. Placing shoes in the freezer to eliminate odors was a technique African American households employed when commercial deodorizers were unavailable. Grandmothers would seal smelly sneakers in plastic bags and freeze them overnight, returning them odor-free by morning. Scientists now confirm that freezing kills bacteria responsible for foot odor, achieving results no spray could match. The extreme cold destroys bacterial cell walls, eliminating the source rather than masking it. This hack was particularly valuable in households with active children whose shoes took serious punishment. Women would clear freezer space on Sunday nights, treating the family's shoes for the week. The practice demonstrated resourceful thinking using existing appliances. Number 10, watermelon rind preserves. After the family ate the red flesh of a watermelon and tossed the rinds into the yard, a domestic worker gathered the thick white and pale green pieces, peeled, cubed, and simmered slowly with sugar, lemon, and a piece of ginger root. The rind turned translucent and tender, almost like candied fruit. The cooking took patience. The rind had to simmer long enough for the sugar to penetrate the dense, flavorless white flesh and turn it glassy. Packed into jars, watermelon rind preserves lasted through the winter without refrigeration. Spread on a biscuit, they tasted sweet and faintly spiced with a texture that gave under the teeth like firm jelly. A food made entirely from what other people threw on the ground. Number 9, fried fish frames. When a domestic worker filleted fish for the family's Friday dinner, the frames remained. The head, the spine, the tail, and the thin strips of flesh still attached to the ribs. In most kitchens, these went to the garbage. A fish frame dusted in seasoned cornmeal and fried in deep fat produced something remarkable. The thin bones crisped until they were chewable. The small pieces of meat along the spine turned golden and crunchy. Fried properly, a fish frame could be eaten whole, bones and all, like a cracker made of fish. Children ate them with hot sauce. Adults ate them with white bread. The fish the family ate at the dining table was boneless and mild. The fish the cook ate in the kitchen was the entire animal, and it carried more flavor than anything on the good plates. Number 24, hot water cornbread. This was the bread of no oven. Corinne's kitchenette had a 2-burner gas ring and nothing else. So she made bread in a cast iron skillet on the stovetop. Yellow cornmeal, a pinch of salt, and boiling water poured straight over the meal until it tightened into a soft dough. She shaped it into small patties with wet hands and fried them in bacon drippings saved from the morning. The outside turned crackling brown. The inside stayed soft as pudding. 3 cents worth of meal fed 5 people. Her grandmother taught her the water had to be rolling hot or the patties would fall apart in the grease. That detail had traveled up from the Carolinas with every cook who boarded the train north. Now here is what most people miss. Hot water cornbread was not a recipe. It was a solution. No oven, no milk, no eggs, no problem. Salting meat well in advance was dismissed as practice that would dry out proteins. Yet African American cooks knew their roasts turned out juicier when salted the night before. Food scientists now call this dry brining and recommend it enthusiastically. Research confirms that salt initially draws moisture to the surface, but given time, that brine reabsorbs deep into the meat, carrying flavor and breaking down tough proteins. The result is meat that stays moist during cooking while developing better browning throughout. Grandmothers would rub their Sunday roasts with salt and spices, letting them rest overnight. What modern chefs present as revolutionary technique, Black cooks practiced for generations without fancy terminology. They trusted their results over expert opinions that turned out to be wrong. Eating organ meats regularly was dismissed as poverty food that sophisticated palates had outgrown, yet African American cooks served liver, gizzards, and kidneys that delivered nutrition no muscle meat could match. Scientists now recognize organ meats as nature's multivitamins, packed with B12, iron, and vitamin A that modern diets chronically lack. Research confirms that liver provides more concentrated nutrition per ounce than any other food. Grandmothers fried chicken livers until crispy, simmered gizzards until tender, and made dishes children grew up loving. The practice ensured families received essential nutrients when resources were limited. What food culture taught people to reject, nutrition science now urges them to reconsider. Those humble organs held the building blocks of health. She never cooked anything the same day she seasoned it. The chicken got salted, peppered, dusted with garlic powder and paprika, maybe a little onion powder rubbed into every crevice, then covered with wax paper and left in the icebox overnight. By morning, the salt had pulled moisture to the surface and drawn it back in, carrying the seasoning deep into the flesh where heat alone could never push it. Pork chops got the same treatment, so did roasts. The trick was time, and time was the one ingredient that cost nothing. This was not brining, not marinating, not anything with the French name attached. It was just letting the meat sit with its seasoning long enough to become something better than it started. You could always tell the difference between chicken seasoned an hour before frying and chicken that spent the night with its spices. One was food, the other was a memory. White sugar does one thing, brown sugar does three. It sweetens, yes, but it also holds moisture. The molasses in brown sugar is hygroscopic, pulling water from the air and keeping baked goods softer longer. And it brings depth that refined white sugar cannot deliver. Something slightly caramel, the taste of the cane before all the complexity was processed away. African American bakers use brown sugar in sweet potato pies, in cornbread, in layer cakes long before the rest of American baking caught up. During the Depression and war years, when white sugar was rationed and tight, brown sugar was both cheaper and more available, and the baked goods from those kitchens were richer for it. Light brown sugar gives warmth. Dark brown gives depth close to molasses. The women who knew which to reach for never needed to explain why.
Dried apple stack cake was a layered dessert with deep Appalachian and African American roots, made by rehydrating dried apples and spicing them into a thick filling. Thin layers of cake were stacked with the apple mixture spread between them, then left to sit so the flavors melded. It was a time-intensive dish that stretched precious fruit, making it last long past harvest. Families treasured it for holidays and gatherings, treating it as a centerpiece dessert. The dried apples, often gathered and preserved months earlier, carried the flavor of summer into the cold months. Children marveled at the tall, impressive cake, while adults admired the patience required to make it. Each slice told the story of careful preservation and thoughtful preparation. Today, stack cake is rarely seen outside of heritage cookbooks or festivals, its labor too demanding for modern kitchens. Yet it remains a delicious reminder of ingenuity and celebration born from scarcity. Forgotten now, it was once a sweet that held families and communities together around the table.
Number 8, folding beaten egg whites into a custardy spoon bread. Here the same cornmeal turned into something almost like a souffle, soft enough to eat with a spoon. The cook scalded the meal with hot milk until it thickened like porridge, then folded in egg whites that had been whipped to stiff peaks, trapping air all through the batter. In the heat of the pan that trapped air, puffed the bread up tall and trembling, with a tender custard center and a faintly brown top. The trick of separating the eggs and beating the whites for lift was carried by enslaved African American cooks trained in fine kitchens who took a French method and made it their own. One of the cooks credited with that souffle technique was James Hemings, enslaved by Thomas Jefferson and schooled in French method, whose hands joined a native grain to a borrowed skill. Spoon bread itself reaches back further still, to the corn dishes of the native peoples of the Carolina Low Country. It was the cornbread for a Sunday table or a guest, richer and gentler than the everyday pan, the kind that announced somebody had taken extra time and care. Beat the whites stiff, fold them gentle, and the bread rises like a cloud. Number 19, sun-drying fruit on tin roofs. This was summer's most important chore in the Black South, and nobody treated it lightly. In July and August, Black women in Georgia and the Carolinas sliced peaches, apples, and figs and laid them out on clean cloth atop tin roofs that baked in the summer sun. The heat and airflow removed moisture until the fruit turned leathery, like soft candy, and could be stored in cotton sacks through the coldest months. The process took 2 or 3 days, depending on the thickness of the slices. Women checked the fruit every few hours, turning the pieces to dry evenly and chasing off insects. Children were assigned to watch the trays and shoo away birds. It was a family operation with real consequences. If you did not dry enough fruit in July, your family had no fruit in January. That was not an inconvenience. That was a gap in the diet that nothing else could fill. The USDA advised against sun drying because it could not guarantee consistent temperatures or protection from contamination. They recommended electric dehydrators that cost more than some families earned in a month. But the tin roofs reached temperatures above 140 degrees on a July afternoon. That is the exact threshold the USDA now recommends for safe dehydration. The women were hitting the target without ever reading the manual. The tin roof was doing the same work as a $200 appliance, using nothing but sunlight. A church woman in Savannah dried enough peaches every summer to fill her pantry through Christmas. She gave bags of dried fruit as gifts the way other people gave cards. Neighbors came by in October asking if she had any peaches left. She always did. She had been doing it since the 1930s. Her peaches never made anyone sick, not once in 50 years. That tin roof was her dehydrator. The sun was free. The knowledge was what cost something. Number 13, reviving stale bread over the rising steam of a pot. 3-day-old biscuits in Big Mama's bread box were never thrown to the chickens. They were brought back to life. She would set a colander or a square of cheesecloth over a pot of simmering water on the back of the stove, lay the dry biscuits or rolls in a single layer on top, and cover the whole thing with a clean dish towel for about 5 minutes. The rising steam reached up into the bread. The starch molecules that had retrograded into hardness rehydrated and softened, and the biscuits came off the colander warm and tender as if they had just come out of the oven. The same move worked on a stale loaf of yesterday's white bread, on a corner of pone, on a hard heel of cornbread saved from supper. Nothing went stale enough to throw away in a house where steam was free. The bread came back, the family ate, and the grocery dollar stretched another day past Sunday. Number 19, storing food underground when there was no icebox in the house. Before electric refrigerators became common in Black households across the rural South, grandmothers kept food cool the same way their own grandmothers had. They dug a root cellar, sometimes nothing more than a deep hole lined with boards and covered with a heavy lid, and they used the steady underground temperature to preserve what the kitchen could not. Sweet potatoes went down there by the bushel after the fall harvest, layered in straw so they would not touch and start to rot. Jars of pickled vegetables sat on low shelves in the dark. A crock of sauerkraut or chow chow could last for months in that cool air. Butter wrapped in a damp cloth stayed firm for days without melting. Some families used a spring house if they lived near running water, setting jars of milk and cream directly in the cold stream so the current kept the temperature down. Others hung a wire basket into the well shaft, lowering a jug of buttermilk until it dangled just above the waterline where the air stayed cool year-round. None of this required a single purchase from a store. The ground itself was the refrigerator, and it cost nothing but the labor to dig it. A grandmother who kept a good root cellar could buy produce at its cheapest in late summer, store it properly, and feed her family through the winter without paying the inflated prices that came once the growing season ended. The savings were enormous. She was not just cooking, she was running a supply chain out of a hole in the yard, and it worked every single year. Soaking greens in salt water was non-negotiable, a step Black grandmothers never skipped, regardless of time constraints. Collards, mustards, and turnip greens came from gardens carrying dirt, sand, and sometimes unwanted guests hiding in their leaves. Grandma filled her sink with cold water, added a generous handful of salt, and submerged those greens for at least 30 minutes. The salt drew out grit and convinced stubborn insects to abandon their hiding places. She lifted the greens out, drained the water, then repeated until it ran perfectly clear. This patience showed respect for the food and the people eating it. Serving gritty greens was a kitchen sin no self-respecting grandmother would commit, and this simple saltwater bath ensured clean, tender leaves every time. Using banana peels to polish leather shoes was an African-American shoe shine technique that leather experts now validate. When commercial polish was unavailable or unaffordable, grandmothers would rub the inside of banana peels on leather, then buff with soft cloth to reveal remarkable shine. Scientists have discovered that banana peels contain potassium and natural oils that condition leather while waxy. Residue creates protective shine. The technique worked on everything from church shoes to work boots, keeping families looking respectable on limited budgets. This hack recycled kitchen scraps into grooming supplies, wasting nothing while achieving professional results. Children learned to save banana peels for Sunday morning shoe preparation, understanding that presentation mattered regardless of circumstances. Number 19, fatback and field peas. Fatback is exactly what it sounds like, a slab of pure fat cut from the back of a hog with no meat running through it at all. In white households, fatback served one purpose: seasoning. A small piece went into the greens or the beans for flavor, and whatever remained was tossed. Domestic workers saved those pieces. They wrapped them in wax paper, carried them home, and dropped them into their own pots. A piece of fatback in a pot of field peas changed everything about the meal. The fat rendered slowly into the cooking liquid, turning thin broth into something that coated the back of a spoon. Field peas were among the cheapest dried legumes in the rural South. They grew in poor soil where other crops failed. Purple hull peas, Crowder peas, black-eyed peas, lady peas, all members of the same family, all cooked the same way, soaked overnight, simmered low with fatback and salt until the skins wrinkled and the insides turned creamy. A domestic worker could set a pot on a Sunday morning before church and come home to a finished supper. What the fatback gave was depth. Without it, field peas tasted flat and watery. With it, a single bowl beside a piece of cornbread could carry a grown woman through a 12-hour shift the next day. This was the core equation of survival cooking. Not technique, not invention. Fat. The right amount of fat in the pot meant the difference between fullness and hunger. Domestic workers understood that arithmetic better than anyone because they solved it daily with ingredients other people threw away. Field pea season ran from late June through September, and during those months the peas were fresh, not dried. Fresh field peas cooked faster and had a sweeter, greener flavor. A woman who tended even a small garden could grow enough to feed her family through the summer and dry the surplus for winter. Number 10, fried apples. with fatback. This was the breakfast of a porter about to work a 14-hour shift. Corrine cut 2 tart apples into thick wedges, skin and all. She fried 3 slices of fatback in a cast iron skillet until the edges went crisp, lifted them onto a plate, and dropped the apples straight into the pork drippings. A spoon of brown sugar on top. The apples softened, caramelized, and drank up the smoke. She served them beside the fatback with a hunk of biscuit. The whole plate cost under a dime, and it kept a grown man on his feet from dawn to dusk. Simple cooking, rich with history, the kind of breakfast that built the Pullman line. Layering seasonings throughout cooking was considered fussy by those who simply salted food at the table, yet African American cooks built flavor in stages that created depth impossible to achieve any other way. Scientists understand that adding spices at different points creates complexity because heat transforms aromatic compounds differently depending on cooking time. Research confirms that blooming spices in hot fat releases oils that carry flavor throughout, while adding fresh herbs at the end preserves bright notes. Grandmothers seasoned meats before browning, added more spices to liquids, and finished with fresh adjustments. What seemed like excessive attention to seasoning was sophisticated technique that professional kitchens now teach as foundational skill. Black cooks understood flavor happened in layers, not all at once. Frying in lard instead of vegetable oil was demonized as artery clogging practice. Yet, African American cooks produced generations of elders who lived long and active lives. Scientists now recognize that lard contains less saturated fat than butter and remains stable at high temperatures without producing harmful trans fats. Research confirms that lard's monounsaturated fat profile resembles olive oil more closely than the saturated villain it was portrayed as. Grandmothers rendered their own lard from pork fat, creating pure cooking medium that made biscuits flaky and fried chicken impossibly crisp. What the food industry spent decades condemning, nutrition researchers now acknowledge was healthier than processed alternatives. That humble lard was never the enemy they claimed. The brown paper grocery bag had a second life in every kitchen that fried chicken regularly. Flour went in first, then salt, pepper, paprika, garlic powder, and whatever else she reached for without looking. The chicken pieces, still damp from their buttermilk soak, got dropped in 2 or 3 at a time, and then the top of the bag got folded over and shaken hard, the flour coating every surface evenly in a way no plate and fork method could match. Kids fought over who got to do the shaking because it felt like a game, the rattling and thumping and the flour dust that puffed out the seams. When the pieces came out coated white and ready for oil, everyone looked uniform and perfect. This was not a Southern invention alone. Black families carried the trick from Alabama kitchens to apartment stoves in Harlem and the west side of Chicago, the paper bag traveling as easily as the recipe itself. The bag went into the trash still dusted with seasoned flour, and the whole kitchen smelled like Saturday morning. And if the biscuit work took patience, it was nothing compared to what starting a pound cake properly required. 7 minutes. That was the standard in the kitchens where pound cake was taken seriously. Not 3, not 5, but a full 7 minutes of butter and sugar beating together before a single egg went in. By the end of it, the butter would be pale and nearly white. So aerated, it had roughly doubled in volume, and the sound of the beaters would have shifted from a dense thud to something lighter and faster. This was not decoration. The extended creaming process is what gives soul food pound cake its characteristic crumb and lift without extra leavening. The sugar crystals working against the fat over those 7 minutes cut millions of tiny air pockets into the butter, and those pockets carried the cake upward in the oven. The 7 up-pound cake tradition, documented in African American households across the South since at least the 1950s, depended on long creaming plus soda carbonation together for its signature height. What you build in the first 7 minutes is what you taste in the last slice.
Cornmeal. Fried apple rings were a treat that turned ordinary fruit into something special. Slices of apples were dipped in a batter of cornmeal and flour, then fried until crisp and golden. The result was sweet, tangy, and crunchy, often sprinkled with a touch of sugar if available. Families made them as a way to stretch apples, transforming a few into enough for everyone to enjoy. Children adored the playful ring shapes and the satisfying crunch, while adults valued the thrift and simplicity. They were often served as a dessert or afternoon snack, offering comfort without extravagance. The use of cornmeal highlighted Southern resourcefulness, combining staples into something delightful. Today, fried apple rings are rarely seen, lost to quicker packaged treats and modern snacks. Yet they remain a testament to creativity, turning a single apple into a feast of flavor and fun. Cornmeal fried apple rings prove that even the simplest ingredients could carry joy.
Number 4, scalding dry meal with boiling water for hot water cornbread. This is the trick promised at the start, and it is maybe the oldest one of all. A kettle was brought to a hard boil, and the bubbling water was poured straight over a bowl of dry cornmeal and salt, stirring fast as it went. The heat cooked the meal on contact, softening the grit and swelling the starch into a thick, sticky dough that pulled together in seconds. The boiling water turns some of the cornstarch into sugar, which is why these little cakes brown so deep and taste faintly sweet with none added. The cook wet her hands, patted that hot dough into small flat patties, and slid them into a skillet of hot grease to fry until they were deep golden and crisp on both sides. The result was crunchy outside, soft and almost creamy within, eaten hot with greens or beans. The method runs straight back to the cooking of the native peoples of this land and the enslaved Africans who recognized cornmeal as a cousin to the grains of home and made bread from water, meal, and salt when there was nothing else to be had. It survived the Depression for the same reason it was born, because it cost almost nothing and filled an empty stomach. Pour the boiling water over the meal, and the simplest cornbread there is comes to life. Number 9, chow chow relish. At the end of every growing season, Black women in the South chopped whatever vegetables remained in the garden: green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, peppers. All of it went into a pot with vinegar, sugar, mustard seed, and turmeric, then was cooked down and packed into jars. Nothing was wasted. Every last vegetable that would have rotted on the vine became a condiment that lasted through winter. The recipe changed every year because the garden changed every year. One autumn, you had more green tomatoes. The next, more cabbage. Chow chow was a mirror of whatever the earth decided to give you, and that made every batch unique. Food safety authorities cautioned against homemade relishes because inconsistent vinegar concentrations could allow bacterial growth. But the combination of vinegar, sugar, and heat creates a preservation environment that food scientists call a hurdle system. Each element alone might not be sufficient. Together, they create multiple barriers that spoilage organisms cannot overcome. The science has a fancy name now. Your grandmother called it putting up chow chow. Same barriers, different labels. Number 5, saving a tough round steak with a heavy bottle and the grain of the meat. The cheap pound of round steak the butcher slid across the paper was the cut that broke most beginners, and Big Mama broke it right back. She laid the steak flat on the cutting board, ran the tip of her paring knife in shallow, diagonal lines across the muscle in one direction, turned the steak 90 degrees, and scored it again the other way. That cross-scoring snapped the long, tough fibers into short ones before a single heat touched the meat. Then she picked up the empty, heavy glass soda bottle she kept by the sink for exactly this job, turned it on its side, and pounded the steak from edge to edge with the rounded shoulder of the bottle until the cut had thinned out and spread wider than her palm. The mechanical breaking did what no marinade could match in 5 minutes flat. The same pound that would have fought a fork came off the pan tender enough to cut with the side of the spoon, and the grocery dollar fed 4 people instead of 2. Number 16, canning everything the garden produced in summer so the family could eat in winter. August was not a month of rest. It was a month of boiling jars, green beans, whole tomatoes, sliced peaches, pear preserves, chow chow, pickled beets, pepper relish. If it grew in the garden or came cheap from a neighbor's tree, it went into a mason jar, got sealed with a hot lid, and went onto the pantry shelf. By October, that shelf looked like a wall of glass, and that wall was winter. A grandmother with a full canning shelf did not need the grocery store from November through March. She opened a jar of tomatoes in January and served them like they had just come off the vine. The work was brutal, standing over a pot of boiling water in the August heat for days at a time, but the payoff lasted 6 months. Crisping chicken skin with baking powder was Grandma's answer to achieving shatteringly crisp fried chicken without a deep fryer. She patted chicken pieces completely dry, then dusted them lightly with baking powder mixed into seasoned flour before frying. The baking powder raised the pH of the skin, helping it brown faster and develop tiny bubbles, creating extra crunch. This technique meant skin stayed crispy even after sitting during a long family meal, never turning soggy. Grandma's chicken crackled when you bit into it, giving way to juicy meat beneath that golden armor. She learned this from her own mother, who discovered it through trial and error in a kitchen without modern conveniences. It remains a simple addition, making an enormous difference. Rubbing butter on minor burns was dismissed by modern medicine before researchers discovered the science behind this African-American remedy. Grandmothers would immediately apply cold butter to small kitchen burns, providing instant cooling relief and creating a protective barrier against infection. While doctors initially criticized this practice, studies have since shown that fat content creates an occlusive layer that locks in moisture and protects damaged skin from bacteria. The cold temperature also provided immediate pain relief by numbing nerve endings at the burn site. This hack was passed from mother to daughter in kitchens where cast iron skillets and wood stoves made burns a common occurrence. Women kept dedicated butter dishes near stoves specifically for this purpose. Number 15, fried green tomatoes. Before the garden tomatoes turned red, the green ones were firm enough to slice into thick rounds and hold their shape in a hot skillet. Dredged in cornmeal and fried in bacon grease, green tomatoes developed a sour, tangy bite inside a crunchy shell. White families sometimes ate fried green tomatoes as a side dish, but more often, the green ones were considered unripe and ignored. Domestic workers picked them early, before the family even knew they were there. Sliced thick and laid into sizzling fat, each round popped and sputtered until the cornmeal crust sealed tight around the top flesh inside. A plate of fried green tomatoes with salt was a meal that cost nothing and used what the family had not yet decided was food. The tartness cut through the grease and left a clean, sharp taste that lingered. Pan-toting was an institution with its own unspoken rules. A domestic worker carried a pan, usually a deep aluminum service pan, to work each morning. At the end of the day, whatever food remained from the family's meals went into that pan. Leftover ham, a few biscuits, the end of a roast, vegetables that would not keep. This was not stealing. Most white families expected it. Some treated it as part of the workers' compensation, an arrangement that kept cash wages even lower than they already were. A woman earning a few dollars a week could feed her children because of what she carried home in that pan. The arrangement blurred the line between payment and charity, and that blurring was deliberate. It allowed white families to feel generous while paying poverty wages. It allowed Black women to feed their families without naming what was happening. The food in that pan kept households alive, and the arrangement kept everyone silent about the terms. Number 11, smothered pork chops. Corrine paid 12 cents for 2 thick bone-in pork chops at the butcher on Lenox Avenue. She dredged them in seasoned flour, browned them in a cast iron pan in bacon grease, then added a sliced onion, a spoon of flour, and a cup of water. She dropped the lid on and let the whole thing simmer on a low burner for 45 minutes until the onions went soft and the gravy turned the color of river mud. The pork came out tender enough to cut with a fork. A spoonful of that gravy over rice was supper for 4. Her aunt in Orangeburg used to say smothered meant you loved it so much you would not let it breathe. That was the kind of humor you remembered decades later. Cooking greens in fat was condemned as adding unnecessary calories to healthy vegetables, yet African American cooks insisted their method made greens work harder. Scientists confirmed that fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K cannot be absorbed without dietary fat, meaning raw or fat-free greens deliver far less nutrition than they promise. Research shows that cooking leafy vegetables in bacon drippings dramatically increases bioavailability of these essential vitamins. Grandmothers sauteed their greens in rendered fat or added them to pots already seasoned with pork. The practice also made vegetables more palatable, encouraging greater consumption. What dietitians dismissed as unhealthy indulgence was nutritional optimization, ensuring bodies extracted maximum benefit. Fat was never the enemy of greens, but their essential partner.
Hog crackling gravy was a trick to bring bold flavor to otherwise plain meals of rice, potatoes, or cornbread. Cracklings, the crispy bits left from rendering pork fat, were stirred into pan drippings and flour to make a rich, textured gravy. The salty crunch of the cracklings turned a simple starch into something hearty and satisfying. Families loved it because it stretched scraps into abundance, proving that nothing from the hog was wasted. It was often poured over large bowls of rice, transforming the cheapest ingredient into a meal fit for a feast. Children scooped it eagerly, not realizing they were eating thrift disguised as indulgence. The gravy carried the smoky, savory essence of pork, a taste that defined many kitchens of the South. Today, hog crackling gravy is nearly forgotten, replaced by smoother gravies with no trace of grit. Yet in its time, it embodied the art of survival cooking, where resourcefulness brought joy to the table. Hog crackling gravy was poverty made flavorful.
Round steak cost next to nothing at the butcher counter because it was tough as shoe leather and nobody with money wanted it. But a woman with a box of Arm & Hammer and 40 minutes of patience could turn that slab into something that fell apart on the fork. A teaspoon of baking soda rubbed into the surface, left to sit for half an hour, then rinsed clean before seasoning. The alkaline powder raised the pH just enough to keep the proteins from seizing up tight during cooking, leaving the fibers loose and tender even over high heat. Nobody in those kitchens used the word pH. They just knew that a little soda and a little time could make a cheap cut taste like it came from a different animal. The same trick worked on stew meat cubed small and browned hot, turning what should have been chewy into something that melted into the gravy. That box of baking soda earned its place on the shelf 10 times over. Time equals 1 second. Buttermilk might be a workaround, but the fat was never negotiable. Before the dough was started, the butter, or lard, if that was what the kitchen kept, went to the coldest available place, the windowsill in winter, the back of the icebox, or a glass of cold water if nothing else worked. Cold fat is the entire secret to a flaky biscuit. When cold butter hits a hot oven, it creates pockets of steam as it suddenly releases, and those pockets become layers. Southern black bakers understood this for generations, even when the explanation lived in muscle memory rather than in words. The rule was simple: never let the fat warm up, work fast, and don't overwork the dough, because overworking activates gluten, and tight gluten is the enemy of a tender biscuit. You could feel when the dough was right, and you could feel the second it went wrong that you had held it one touch too long.
Scuppernong wine. Syrup was a sweet trick pulled from the wild grapes of the South, boiled down into a thick syrup. Families harvested scuppernongs in late summer, pressing them for juice and reducing the liquid into a golden syrup poured over biscuits or pancakes. The syrup captured the musky sweetness of the grapes, offering a taste of abundance even in lean times. Children loved it as a rare treat, licking it from spoons when mothers turned their backs. For adults, it was a way to preserve the harvest and add luxury to otherwise plain meals. This syrup reflected the creativity of households that refused to waste even the smallest fruit. Though it required time and patience, the payoff was a jar of sunshine to last through winter. Today, Scuppernong wine syrup is nearly unknown, its memory tied to homesteads and family gatherings. Forgotten now, it remains a symbol of thrift and sweetness pulled straight from the land. It was heritage in a jar, poured with love.
Number 17, the cast iron skillet itself. No tool in the southern kitchen carried more weight, and not just the literal kind. For most families, through most of these years, the heavy black pan was not one choice among many. It was the only pan there was. Everything came out of it: the cornbread and the fried chicken, the beans, the gravy, the eggs at dawn. It was bought once and meant to last a lifetime, and it usually outlasted the cook. A good skillet was never scrubbed down to bare metal. The thin layer of cooked-in fat, the seasoning, was guarded like money, because it was money in a way. That black sheen meant the bread released clean and the crust browned even, with no flour and no fuss. When a pan was passed from a mother to a daughter, it came already seasoned by years of cornbread and pork fat, carrying the memory of every meal cooked before. That was the real inheritance, more than any china. The deeper history sits in the iron too. Many of these pans came up through plantation kitchens, where enslaved black women fed everyone and cooked over open hearths with whatever they were given, turning the cheapest meal into something that tasted like care. The skill of reading a hot pan by sound and smell, of knowing the exact moment to pour, was learned hard and handed down on purpose, one of the few things that could be kept and passed along when so much else was taken. So the skillet was never just a skillet, it was a record of who taught whom, a tool that held heat and held history at the same time. A grandmother's pan was her signature, and the cornbread it made was proof the lesson had been received. Treat the iron with respect and it will outlast you too. Number 13, fermented hot sauce. Black families in Louisiana and the Carolina Low Country packed fresh peppers into jars with salt and let them sit on the shelf for weeks or months. The peppers bubbled, softened, and transformed into a tangy, complex hot sauce through lacto fermentation. No vinegar needed, no cooking required. The salt drew water from the peppers and created a brine where lactic acid bacteria thrived, while harmful organisms could not. The longer the sauce sat, the deeper the flavor became. A jar that started sharp and simple in September tasted rounded and complex by Thanksgiving, like wine aging in a barrel. Health codes eventually required commercially sold hot sauces to be heat processed, which killed the beneficial bacteria that made fermented sauce special. But research published in journals on food microbiology has confirmed that lacto-fermented foods contain probiotic strains that support digestive health. The hot sauce on your grandmother's table was alive with beneficial bacteria that a pasteurized bottle from the grocery store does not contain. She was feeding your family's gut microbiome before that phrase existed. Number 21, tenderizing tough greens with a splash of vinegar. The collards that came up out of the fall garden after the first frost was sweeter, but the leaves were leathery enough to resemble a shoe. Big Mama dealt with them by tipping a small splash of apple cider vinegar into the simmering pot about an hour in, and then she let the greens go for another 60 to 90 minutes without lifting the lid more than twice. The mild acid in the vinegar breaks down the tough cellulose in mature greens, which is why the leaves end up silky instead of stringy. It also cuts the natural bitterness that lives in the stems. She never measured the splash. She knew the right amount by the smell that rose off the pot, somewhere between sharp and sweet, and she trusted the pot to tell her when the greens had given in. The pot liquor at the bottom was the prize, dark and savory, ready to be sopped up with a square of warm cornbread. Number 20, bartering eggs and garden vegetables with neighbors instead of spending cash. Money was scarce, but eggs were currency. A grandmother with 6 laying hens had something better than coins in her apron pocket. She traded a dozen eggs for a quart of milk from the woman down the road. She swapped a basket of ripe tomatoes for a sack of cornmeal. The system ran on trust, and it ran without a receipt. Whole blocks and entire rural roads operated this way during the worst years. No middleman, no markup, no store, just 2 women standing at a fence line on a Tuesday morning, deciding what their families needed that week and making it happen with what they already had. There is a reason these tricks worked, and it was not luck. Black grandmothers during the Depression were operating inside a system that was built to keep them poor. Sharecropping meant debt before the first seed hit the ground. Jim Crow meant the better paying jobs were locked behind a door they could not open. Redlining meant the neighborhoods with the cheapest groceries were the neighborhoods they were not allowed to live in, so they built a parallel economy inside their own kitchens. Every trick on this list is a workaround invented by women who got no help and expected none. The grocery bill was the one fight where intelligence and discipline could win against a rigged system, and they won it every single week, not with coupons, not with charity, with knowledge passed from mother to daughter while standing over a hot stove. Sweetening tomatoes with sugar was how Grandma coaxed the best flavor from canned tomatoes and out-of-season produce lacking natural sweetness. A pinch of sugar added to tomato sauce, stewed tomatoes, or soup balanced the acidity without making the dish taste sweet. This trick brought out the fruit's natural flavor, making cheap canned tomatoes taste almost as good as vine-ripened summer ones. Grandma added sugar to her spaghetti sauce, vegetable soup, and stewed tomatoes served over rice. She knew that acidity needed balance and that a little sweetness rounded out sharp edges. Children who turned up their noses at tomatoes would clean their plates when Grandma made them, never realizing her secret. This simple addition made economical cooking taste special, proving flavor didn't require expensive ingredients. Rubbing walnuts on scratched wood furniture was a restoration technique passed through generations of African American families. When wooden tables and chairs showed wear, grandmothers would rub walnut meat directly into scratches, watching them seemingly disappear. Scientists now understand that walnut oil penetrates wood grain, while the natural brown pigments fill and camouflage light-colored scratches. The technique worked best on medium to dark finishes, where the walnut's color blended naturally. This hack saved families from expensive refinishing while keeping beloved furniture in service for decades. Women kept bowls of walnuts handy not just for eating, but for furniture maintenance. The practice represented practical wisdom about natural oils and wood care passed quietly between generations. Number 23, cold sweet potato eaten whole. Sweet potatoes baked for the family's candied yams were prepared in batches. The small ones, too knotted or too narrow for a proper dish, stayed in the kitchen. A domestic worker peeled one while it was still warm and ate it plain, holding it in her hand like a piece of fruit. No butter, no brown sugar, no marshmallow, just the dense orange flesh, sweet enough on its own. Sweet potatoes grew easily in sandy southern soil and stored well through the winter in a root cellar or under a porch. A woman who tended a small garden at home could grow enough to eat one nearly every day through the cold months. A single sweet potato could carry a woman from mid-morning to supper time without hunger returning. She ate it standing, wiped her hands on her apron, and kept working. Number 14, mustard greens with pot liquor. A bundle of mustard greens at the Harlem market in 1928 cost 6 cents. A smoked ham hock cost a dime. Corrine would clean the greens in a full sink of cold water 3 times to get the grit out, because mustard greens hold dirt in every crease. She dropped them in a pot with the ham hock, 2 cups of water, and a pinch of sugar to cut the bitterness. She let them cook for an hour and a half on a low burner. The leaves collapsed. The broth at the bottom of the pot turned thick and dark and smoky. That broth had a name, pot liquor. Some cooks called it the holiest thing in a black kitchen because it carried everything the greens had to give. You poured it over cornbread. You drank it from the ladle when the pot came off the heat. A cup of pot liquor on a cold Harlem morning was better than any medicine. The doctors uptown would not have agreed, but the grandmothers knew. Pot liquor carried iron, vitamin, and centuries of kitchen wisdom. When Corin's neighbor Ethel caught a fever in January of 1928, Corin brought her a covered bowl of pot liquor and a wedge of cornbread. 3 days later, Ethel was back at her typewriter at the Amsterdam News. The thing is, pot liquor was never just a broth. It was the taste of every pot of greens every black woman had ever cooked in this country. It was a ledger of salt and smoke and green leaves and the patience to wait 90 minutes for a bundle of mustards to give up their gifts. When Corin passed in 1971, her daughter found the same chipped enamel pot under the kitchen sink. It still smelled like greens. 43 years of greens. That pot told the story of a century in a single smell. Cooking with smoked meat for seasoning was criticized as adding unnecessary fat to healthy vegetables. Yet African American cooks understood something deeper about nutrition. Scientists now recognize that smoke contains compounds with antimicrobial properties while adding complex flavors impossible to replicate artificially. Research confirms that small amounts of smoked pork provide essential amino acids that transform plant-based meals into complete proteins. Ham hocks, bacon ends, and smoked turkey necks added collagen that promoted gut health. Grandmothers knew exactly how much meat was needed to season an entire pot of beans or greens, stretching precious protein while maximizing flavor. What dietitians once condemned, nutrition science, now acknowledges as intuitive understanding of how flavor and nutrition work together.
Boiled peanut soup was a clever way to turn a cheap, plentiful snack into a rich and sustaining meal. Families started with boiled peanuts, soft and savory, then blended them with broth, onions, and sometimes milk to create a creamy soup. It was high in protein and carried a nutty depth that filled bellies when meat was scarce. African American kitchens especially valued peanuts, which had been part of food traditions since arriving from Africa. Children who were used to eating boiled peanuts from paper bags found it surprising to see them turned into soup, but the taste was comforting. For many, it was a dish of invention, born of necessity yet delicious enough to be remembered fondly. Peanut soup showed the creativity of cooks who could stretch a handful of legumes into a meal for an entire family. Though rarely seen today, it reflects the ingenuity of those who could not afford to waste anything. Boiled peanut soup was both survival and celebration, served warm with pride.
Long before that pot liquor reached the table, there were the beans themselves, and the women who cooked them knew that dried beans required an overnight conversation with water before they would cooperate. A pound of pintos or navy beans went into a large bowl covered with cold water by 3 inches because they would swell as they drank. Into that water went a pinch of baking soda, just enough to soften the skins and break down the oligosaccharides, the complex sugars responsible for the discomfort nobody wanted to discuss at dinner. By morning, the beans had doubled in size, the water had turned cloudy, and the soaking liquid got poured off and replaced with fresh water for cooking. That overnight soak cut the cooking time nearly in half and produced beans that were creamy through instead of chalky in the center. Women who skipped this step ended up with hard beans and regret, and the older ones would shake their heads slowly because they had warned you. The difference between a good custard pie and a great one often came down to a single small can. Evaporated milk from the shelf with the 2 punched holes in the top was not a shortcut in African American kitchens. It was a deliberate choice. Regular milk carries too much water, and in a custard filling, that excess dilutes the proteins that need to set the pie firm. The result weeps liquid into the crust and won't slice clean. Evaporated milk has had roughly 60% of its water removed, concentrating the proteins and milk sugars until it's nearly twice as rich. African American bakers adopted it in custard pies, sweet potato, chess, buttermilk, coconut, from at least the 1930s onward, when canned goods became staples in rural Southern households that couldn't count on fresh dairy every week. The silkier texture, the clean edge when cut, none of that came from talent alone. It came from knowing what was in the can and exactly why it worked better than what came out of the bottle.
Ground acorn flour. Bread was a survival food born from foraging, using acorns gathered in the fall to make flour. Families would crack the nuts, leach them in water to remove bitterness, then grind them into meal. Mixed with cornmeal or wheat flour, the acorn flour became hearty loaves of bread with a nutty flavor. Though labor-intensive, it provided sustenance when store-bought flour was too costly or scarce. Children often joined in shelling acorns, their hands stained from the tannins, while adults handled the soaking and grinding. The bread itself was dense and filling, a reminder that the forest could feed families if they had the patience to prepare it. For many, it was a food of hard times, eaten more out of necessity than delight. Today, it is almost forgotten, except among foragers or survivalists. Yet ground acorn flour bread reflects the ingenuity of past generations who made the land itself their pantry. It was resilience baked into every loaf, proof that nothing was overlooked.
Number 7, binding the batter with one good beaten egg. A single egg did quiet, important work, and a careful cook never wasted it. Beaten into the buttermilk before the meal went in, that one egg bound the crumb so a slice held its shape on a plate instead of falling to dust under the knife. The egg added richness too, a faint golden tenderness that plain meal and water could never reach on their own. It helped the bread brown deeper on top and lifted the texture just enough to keep it from baking down into a heavy brick. The protein in the egg sets as it bakes, building a gentle frame around the corn so the crumb has something to cling to instead of falling loose the moment a knife touches it. In a kitchen where eggs came from the hens out back and were counted carefully, spending one on the daily bread was a small choice that paid off in every bite. When the hens were laying well, the cornbread got an egg and turned out fine-grained and proud. One egg was the difference between bread that crumbled and bread that sliced clean. Number 24, pot liquor preservation. When your grandmother boiled collard greens with a ham hock for 3 hours, the liquid left behind was not waste. It was medicine in a mason jar. She saved that greenish broth, rich as liquid gold, poured it into jars, and kept it on the back porch in winter or the root cellar in summer. Families drank it straight or sopped it with cornbread. Extension agents told black families to throw the cooking water away because boiling destroyed the vitamins. They were half right and completely wrong. Researchers in Spain found that boiling extracted 50% of total flavonoids and 60% of vitamin C into the cooking liquid. The vitamins were not destroyed. They migrated into the pot liquor like passengers changing trains. The women who saved that broth were capturing every nutrient the greens had to give. They did not need a study to know it kept their children strong through winter. Number 10, softening cold butter under a warm, overturned plate. When the recipe called for soft butter and the stick had just come out of the icebox, Big Mama did not wait an hour. She ran a heavy dinner plate under hot tap water for 30 seconds, dried it on her apron, and set it upside down over the cold stick like a little dome. 3 or 4 minutes was all it took. The trapped warmth from the plate softened the butter evenly without melting a single edge, so the creaming came together smooth and the cake batter stayed light. The same warm plate move worked on a brick of cream cheese for the holiday cookies or any hard fat the recipe asked her to whip. No microwave on the counter, no melted puddle to scrape up, just a warm plate, a patient hand, and butter that came back to room temperature on her schedule. Number 6, cooking one big communal pot to stretch scraps across the whole family. A pot of beans or stew assembled from whatever was left in the kitchen could feed 8 or 10 people for a fraction of what separate plates would have cost. Monday's leftover rice went in. Tuesday's last scrap of smoked meat went in. A potato from the garden, an onion from the neighbor's trade, a handful of dried lima beans that had been soaking in water overnight. The pot sat on the back of the stove for hours, low and slow. By supper time, it was thick, savory, and enough. This was not a recipe. It was a system. One fire, one pot, one meal. Everybody at the table eats the same thing, and nobody walks away hungry. Keeping brown sugar soft with bread was kitchen wisdom that saved countless batches of cookies, cakes, and candied yams from disaster. Black grandmothers knew brown sugar turned into a rock-hard brick if left alone too long, making it impossible to measure. Her solution was elegantly simple. She placed a slice of fresh white bread directly in the sugar container and sealed it tight. Within a day or two, the sugar absorbed moisture from the bread, returning to its soft, scoopable state. The bread became stale, having sacrificed its moisture for the greater good. This trick meant Grandma always had workable brown sugar ready, never having to chip away at a solid mass. It was resourcefulness solving problems with what was already in the kitchen. Using vinegar rinses to make hair shine was an African-American beauty secret that hairdressers now scientifically support and recommend. Grandmothers would mix apple cider vinegar with water for final rinses after washing, producing remarkable shine and manageability that lasted for days. Scientists have confirmed that vinegar's acidity closes the hair cuticle, smoothing scales that cause dullness while removing soap residue. This technique was especially valuable for natural hair textures, enhancing curl definition and reducing tangles without expensive products. Women would share their exact ratios at beauty parlors, perfecting formulas through generations of careful experimentation. The practice cost pennies compared to commercial products. Number 13, souse meat. When a hog was slaughtered, the head went to the cook. The cheeks, the snout, the ears, the tongue, all of it simmered for hours until the meat fell apart and the cooking liquid turned thick with natural gelatin. The meat was picked clean, chopped fine, seasoned with vinegar and red pepper, and packed into a loaf pan. Cooled overnight, it set firm enough to slice. Souse meat was eaten cold on bread or by itself, tangy and rich with a texture that held together when sliced, but fell apart on the tongue. It kept for days without refrigeration because the vinegar preserved it. A loaf of souse in the pantry meant a woman had food waiting at home, no matter how late she finished work. No reheating, no preparation, just a knife and a plate. Number 12, oxtails and gravy. The tail of a cow was a throwaway cut in the 1940s. Butchers sold them for almost nothing or gave them away to anyone willing to take them. Oxtails are mostly bone and connective tissue, but braised slowly in a covered pot with onions and a splash of vinegar. The collagen breaks down into a gelatin-rich gravy that thickens as it cools. The small pieces of meat between the vertebrae turn impossibly tender after hours of simmering. A pot of oxtails over rice fed a family of 5. Today, oxtails cost more per pound than many premium steaks. The food that once marked poverty has been repriced as a delicacy. The people who made it worth eating in the first place never saw that profit. Number 11, day-old bread pudding. White families ate fresh bread. What went stale was destined for the trash. A domestic worker who saved stale slices over the course of a week had enough by Saturday to make a bread pudding that fed her household through the weekend. Torn bread soaked in a custard of eggs, milk, sugar, and vanilla, poured into a greased pan and baked until the top puffed golden and the center set firm. The eggs gave it substance. The sugar gave it sweetness. The bread gave it body. Some women added raisins or nutmeg. Some added nothing because there was nothing to add. The result was a dessert dense enough to serve as a meal and cheap enough to make from what others had already decided was worthless. A good bread pudding improved overnight as the custard settled deeper into the crumb. Number 20, salt pork hocks and cabbage. A whole head of green cabbage in 1928, Harlem cost 4 cents. A salt pork hock from the corner butcher cost another dime. That was 14 cents for a pot that fed 6 people. Corrine boiled the hock for an hour until the broth turned cloudy with salt and fat. Then she quartered the cabbage and dropped it in for 20 minutes more. The cabbage came out soft, silver, and swimming in the richest liquor you ever tasted. You sopped it up with cornbread. You did not need anything else. Her grandfather had eaten the same supper in the Low Country on Sundays after church. A century of the same dish, simmered in the same way by hands that had never tasted anything else. Back then, that was enough. Here's what working people knew. A pot of cabbage is a pot of peace. Drinking pot liquor from greens was a practice that made outsiders cringe. Yet African-American families treasured every drop of that dark, rich cooking liquid. Modern nutrition research confirms what grandmothers always knew, that broth contains concentrated vitamins and minerals that leach from the greens during cooking. Scientists discovered pot liquor, holds more nutritional value than the vegetables themselves, packed with water-soluble vitamins B and C. Families would sip it warm from cups or soak cornbread until it softened into a nourishing meal. During lean times, this liquid gold stretched resources while delivering essential nutrition. What doctors now call nutrient-dense broth, Black families simply called pot liquor, and they never wasted a single precious drop. Adding a splash of vinegar to pie crust dough was the kind of trick that never made it into any cookbook your family owned, because the women who made the best pies never consulted one. A tablespoon of apple cider vinegar stirred into the ice water before it hit the flour kept the gluten from developing too far, producing a crust so flaky it shattered at the touch of a fork. The acid worked against the proteins that wanted to bind together and turn the dough tough, and the result was a pastry that held its shape in the oven but came apart on the tongue like it was barely holding itself together. Sweet potato pie, buttermilk pie, vinegar pie itself, they all started with this same quiet trick. She mixed the dough fast, handled it as little as possible, and never rolled it more than once. The secret was not in the filling, it was in what nobody saw, the invisible chemistry happening inside the crust before the pie ever reached the oven. The biscuits demanded improvisation, and the tool was already on the table. In nearly every African-American kitchen from the 1930s through the 1960s, there was a wide, heavy drinking glass with a second job nobody discussed. It just was the biscuit cutter, used so long that a faint ring of flour had worn into the rim. You press straight down, never twist it. Twisting seals the cut edges and prevents the layers from rising, and the glass left a clean circle that baked into exactly the size that kitchen had always made. The no-twist rule is technical. A clean edge lets steam escape straight up through the open layers, creating the visible separation you can pull apart with your hands. The glass had the right rim. The woman pressing it knew the physics, even if she never used that word.
Chitterling fritters were another way African-American kitchens stretched every part of the hog, ensuring nothing went to waste. Chitlins, or pig intestines, were cleaned, boiled, and then chopped finely before being mixed with flour, eggs, and seasonings. The mixture was formed into patties and fried in hot fat until golden. The result was crispy on the outside, tender inside, and packed with flavor. Families prized fritters because they could feed many mouths with very little meat, transforming scraps into something satisfying. For children, the fritters felt like a snack, even if they came from humble origins. The smell of frying chitlins was strong, but the taste was treasured by those who grew up with it. Chitterling fritters were not just food, but part of a tradition that honored the skill of turning the least into the most. Today, they are rarely made, their labor-intensive preparation out of step with fast meals. Yet they remain a reminder of resilience and ingenuity, showing how survival could be fried into something unforgettable.
Number 13, never adding sugar. This was the rule they never broke, and it was almost a point of pride. Real Southern cornbread had no sugar in it. Not a spoonful, not a pinch. To these cooks, sugar turned bread into cake, and cake had no business sitting next to a pot of greens or a bowl of beans. Cornbread was meant to be a savory thing, a vessel for soaking up pot liquor and gravy, and sweetness only got in the way of that job. The corn itself carried all the gentle sweetness the bread ever needed, especially good stone ground meal that still had its oil. Sweet cornbread was sometimes called Yankee cornbread, said with a small frown, because the sugar marked it as somebody else's recipe from somewhere up north. There was also plain sense in the rule. Sugar was expensive and was saved for the cobblers and the cakes that earned the splurge on a special day. Wasting it on the everyday bread that came to the table 3 times a week made no sense in a careful kitchen. So the bread stayed honest, browning deep and tasting of corn and fat and a little salt, exactly the way it was meant to taste beside greens and beans. A cook who slipped in sugar gave herself away. Leave the sugar in the bowl where it belongs. Number 8, salted watermelon rind pickles. Nothing went to waste in a household that understood what waste really meant. After the red flesh was eaten, black families in the South peeled the green skin from the white rind, cut it into cubes, and soaked them in a heavy salt brine overnight. The salt drew moisture from the rind and firmed the texture, turning something soft into something with bite. The next day, the rind was rinsed, then boiled in a spice vinegar syrup with cinnamon, cloves, and allspice. The kitchen smelled like Christmas in the middle of August. The rind pieces turned translucent as they absorbed the syrup, then were packed into jars and sealed while still hot. The result was a sweet, tangy, crunchy pickle that lasted for months. Church suppers put watermelon rind pickles on the table next to the deviled eggs, and the jar always went home empty. Health authorities dismissed rind pickles as a waste product novelty, but the double preservation method, first salt brining and then acid pickling, creates 2 separate antimicrobial barriers. Modern pickle manufacturers use the same sequential process. Your grandmother just used it on the part of the watermelon that everyone else threw away. That rind was her pantry's safety net. Number 9, catching homemade fudge at softball stage with cold water. There was no candy thermometer hanging in Big Mama's kitchen, and her fudge set up firm and creamy every single Christmas. The test she used was older than the stove she stood at. As the sugar, butter, cocoa, and evaporated milk bubbled away in the heavy pot, she kept a teacup of ice-cold water sitting right beside the burner. Every couple of minutes, she would dip a wooden spoon into the boiling syrup, pull a small drop, and let it fall straight into the cold water. If the drop dissolved away into a thread, the candy was not ready. If it sank to the bottom and held its shape as a soft, pliable ball you could pinch between 2 fingers, the syrup was at the softball stage, 238 degrees on the thermometer she did not own. She pulled the pot off the eye, let it cool to lukewarm, and beat it by hand with a wooden spoon until the surface lost its shine and turned matte. That was the signal to pour, and the fudge cut clean from the buttered pan once it set. Number 15, foraging wild greens from ditches, fields, and creek banks. Poke salad, dandelion greens, lamb's quarters, watercress, growing where the creek ran shallow over rocks. These were not weeds to a Depression-era grandmother. They were free food growing in places nobody else thought to look. The trick was knowing which ones to pick, when to pick them young, and how to cook them safe. Poke salad had to be boiled and drained at least twice to draw the bitterness and toxins out. Dandelion leaves were best before the plant flowered, while they were still tender. This was knowledge that came from generations of women who understood the land around them, and it did not cost a single cent at any store. Seasoning cast iron with bacon grease was the foundation of every black grandmother's kitchen, transforming ordinary cookware into heirlooms passed through generations. After cooking bacon, Grandma poured the rendered fat into a tin can kept beside the stove, then used that precious grease to coat her skillets while still warm. She rubbed it in with a cloth, working the fat into every pore until it gleamed like black glass. This wasn't just maintenance, but kitchen alchemy, creating a non-stick surface superior to anything factory made. The bacon grease added flavor to everything cooked afterward, giving cornbread its golden crust and fried, and chicken its taste. Each use built upon the last, creating layers that told the story of countless family meals. Using coffee grounds to deodorize refrigerators was standard practice in African American households decades before commercial deodorizers existed. Grandmothers would place bowls of spent grounds on refrigerator shelves where they absorbed odors from onions, fish, and leftovers with remarkable effectiveness. Scientists have since confirmed that coffee's porous structure and nitrogen content make it exceptionally effective at trapping volatile odor compounds. The grounds work better than baking soda for many strong smells. This hack recycled kitchen waste into a cleaning solution, exemplifying the waste-nothing philosophy of resourceful households. Women who couldn't afford commercial products created their own solutions, proving that ingenuity could replace spending. Number 6, leftover pie dough fried with sugar. After rolling out crust for the family's pie, there were always scraps left on the counter, rough shapes, torn edges, the piece stuck to the rolling pin. No domestic worker threw those away. The scraps went into a hot skillet with butter and fried flat until both sides turned golden. Pulled from the pan and sprinkled with sugar and cinnamon while still warm, they became a pastry that children fought over. This never appeared in any recipe book. It existed only in the knowledge passed between women in kitchens. A grandmother showed a daughter, who showed a granddaughter, and the tradition survived without a written name. Some families called them pie crust cookies. Some called them nothing at all. They were just the scraps that turned sweet when a woman decided not to waste them. Number 5, leftover pie filling scraped from the bowl. After the pie was assembled and the filling poured, what clung to the sides of the mixing bowl belonged to no one. A domestic worker ran her finger along the edge or used a piece of bread to wipe the bowl clean. Sweet potato filling, pecan custard, buttermilk batter. Whatever the family was having for dessert, the cook tasted first, not from a plate, but from the residue left behind. Children who came into the kitchen after school learned to wait for that bowl. The cook handed it over without a word. That smear of raw filling on bread was sweeter than the finished pie because it came with no rules about portions. Nobody cut it into even slices. Nobody decided who got the first piece. The bowl was the one part of the dessert that never reached the dining room. Number 21, crackling bread. Cracklings were the crispy bits of skin left over after rendering lard from fatback. Most Harlem cooks saved them in a jar by the stove. On a cold Saturday, Corrine would crumble a cup of cracklings into her cornbread batter, pour it into a greased skillet, and slide the whole thing into a neighbor's oven 2 flights down. The bread came back 20 minutes later, smelling like smoke and pork and warm butter. It was rich in a way store bread could never be. A wedge of crackling bread beside a bowl of greens was supper all by itself. Her mother in Orangeburg County had made it the exact same way in 1898. Passed down, traditional, the kind of bread that tasted like a memory even when you were eating it the first time. Cooking with cast iron skillets was standard practice in African American kitchens long before scientists discovered the pans actually fortified food with dietary iron. Research confirms that acidic foods like tomatoes and greens cooked in cast iron absorb significant amounts of the mineral, helping prevent anemia in communities with limited access to red meat. Those heavy black pans passed down through generations were doing double duty as cookware and nutritional supplements. Grandmothers seasoned their skillets with lard, building layers of natural non-stick coating that modern chemists struggle to replicate safely. What seemed like stubborn attachment to old equipment was actually health intervention disguised as tradition. Scientists now recommend cast iron cooking for the same benefits Black cooks enjoyed for centuries. Pickled watermelon rind turns summer's leftover scraps into a tangy, sweet preserve that lasted well into winter months. Grandmothers trimmed the green outer skin and pink flesh, leaving only white rind to be cut into uniform pieces. The rinds were soaked overnight in salted water to firm the texture before being drained thoroughly. A pickling syrup of vinegar, sugar, cinnamon sticks, and cloves was poured over prepared rinds in sterilized jars. After processing, jars were stored in cool cellars where flavors developed. Over several weeks, the result was a crunchy, sweet and sour condiment served alongside meats or eaten as a snack. This preserve represented the waste-nothing philosophy that sustained families through lean times when every scrap carried value and purpose. There was no thermometer clipped to the side of the pot, no digital readout blinking on the counter. She knew the oil was ready because she heard it, a flick of water from wet fingertips, a tiny crackle of flour pinched and dropped from above, or just the sound the grease made when it hit that precise shimmer, a low hiss shifting into a sharp, confident pop the moment something touched the surface. That sound meant 350 degrees, give or take, and she was never wrong. Kids learned to stay back when the popping started. They also learned to listen, because one day they would stand over that pot themselves. The women who fried fish on Friday nights could judge temperature by ear, the way a piano tuner judges pitch, and the chicken that came out of their oil was golden every single time. Nobody fries with that same ear anymore, because nobody stands close long enough to learn. But if the drip tin represented careful economy, fat saved, fat cataloged, used with precision, the mayonnaise cake represented something else entirely, a Depression-era act of radical substitution that worked so well it outlasted the crisis that invented it. The first published recipe appeared in 1927, and Hellmann's promoted it nationally by 1937, but in African American households, it spread the way most of this knowledge spread, through women telling other women, not through advertisements. The logic was brilliant. Mayonnaise is emulsified oil and egg yolks with acid, the same three components a cake asks you to add separately. One jar replaced the eggs, replaced the oil, and provided moisture that kept the crumb tender for days. The cake that came out was not a compromise. It was richer, moister, and lasted longer than the standard version. Some of the women who baked it every year until they were gone never knew they were using a Depression innovation. They just knew it was the one their mothers had made.
Pickled pig ears were a Southern delicacy born from the nose-to-tail tradition of wasting nothing. Pig ears, often overlooked cuts, were simmered until tender, then packed in jars with vinegar, salt, and spices to pickle. The result was chewy, tangy, and surprisingly flavorful, enjoyed as a snack on crackers or straight from the jar. Some added chili peppers for a kick, while others kept it simple, letting the vinegar shine. Families loved them because they preserved well without refrigeration, making them valuable in times when resources were scarce. Children were sometimes hesitant to try them, but adults knew they packed both flavor and nutrition. For communities determined to honor every part of the hog, pig ears were no different than hams or chops in value. Today, they are mostly forgotten outside of specialty shops or older cooks who still remember their place on the table. Pickled pig ears represent resilience and resourcefulness, a reminder of how people turned humble cuts into beloved bites that carried stories as well as sustenance.
Number 10, shaping corn pone by hand with just meal, water, and soap. When the larder was nearly bare, this was the bread that still got made. There was no buttermilk, no egg, no leavening, only stone ground meal, a little salt, and enough hot water to bring it together into a stiff dough. A cook scooped up a handful, patted it into a small oval right in her palm, and pressed her fingerprints into the top before it ever met the heat. That hand shaping is where the name comes from, since pone traces back to an Indian word the native peoples of the Southeast used for their baked corn cakes. The word can be traced to the Powhatan term apon, meaning something baked, recorded by English colonists in Virginia as early as 1612 when they ate the bread the Powhatan people called ponap. The dough went into a greased pan or straight onto the hot hearth, and it baked up dense, chewy, and honest, made to be broken apart and dipped in pot liquor. Pone fed enslaved families and poor farmers alike because it asked for almost nothing and filled a working body all morning. It is the oldest cornbread there is, the recipe stripped down to corn and fire. When the cupboard was empty, hands and meal and water was still enough. Number 11, grease jar reuse. Every black kitchen in the South kept a can or jar on the back of the stove where leftover cooking grease was poured after frying. Bacon grease, chicken drippings, pork fat, it all went into that jar and was used again and again to season skillets, fried cornbread, and flavor vegetables. Health officials called this unsanitary and warned it could harbor bacteria and rancid fats that promoted disease. The science is more complicated than that. Render animal fats stored at room temperature remain stable far longer than vegetable oils because their saturated fat structure resists oxidation. The salt content from seasoned cooking further inhibited bacterial growth. As long as the grease was strained and kept free of food particles, it stayed safe for weeks. Modern chefs now sell small jars of bacon fat at specialty stores for $10. Your grandmother kept hers in a coffee can and never thought twice about it. That grease jar was not a health hazard. It was a flavor vault, a seasoning library in a single can that black women maintained for generations. Number 19, sharpening the kitchen knife on the rim of a plate. The kitchen drawer in Big Mama's house did not contain a sharpening stone because the underside of every dinner plate she owned was already won. When the paring knife started to drag through a tomato instead of slicing it, she would flip an everyday ceramic plate upside down on the counter, find the unglazed ring around the rim where the plate had rested on the kiln, and draw the blade across that bare ceramic at a low angle, 10 or 12 strokes per side. The unglazed clay is harder than carbon steel, hard enough to grind a true edge back onto a dull blade in under a minute. Every black grandmother in the South seemed to know this without ever being told. Some learned it from their own mothers. Some figured it out the first time their best knife went soft. But the move was so common across kitchens that food historians now treat it as a signature of mid-century African-American home cooking. The plate did double duty, and the knife went right back to work. Number 7, stretching coffee with roasted chicory root. Coffee was one of the few staples a family could not grow in the yard, barter for at the fence, or make from table scraps. It had to be purchased, and during the Depression, even a small bag was a real expense for a family living on sharecropper wages. So grandmothers across Louisiana and the rest of the Deep South reached back to a trick that went all the way to the Civil War, when Union blockades cut off coffee shipments and Southerners had to improvise. Chicory root pulled from the ground where it grew wild in ditches and along country roads was scrubbed clean, sliced thin, dried in the oven on a low flame, and then roasted until it turned dark and fragrant. Ground to a fine powder, it was mixed with the real coffee, half and half. The chicory deepened the color, added a roasted bitterness that blended with the coffee, and made a half pound of beans do the work of a full pound. Some families came to love the taste so much that they never went back, even after money was less tight. In New Orleans, chicory coffee became a tradition that outlived the Depression entirely and is still served in restaurants and homes today. But the origin was not flavor preference. It was an economic decision made by women who refused to surrender their morning cup but could not justify paying full price. The root grew free. The labor was their own. A grandmother who knew where to dig chicory had a coffee extender that cost nothing. For the rest of her life, she dried it, roasted it, ground it in the same hand mill she used for the beans, and mixed them together before the water boiled. Nobody at the breakfast table knew unless she decided to tell them. Number 18, sweet potato peelings, fried crisp. When a domestic worker peeled sweet potatoes for the family's candied yams or pie, the peelings curled off in long strips, still carrying a thin layer of orange flesh. Most cooks in white kitchens threw the peelings straight into the waste bucket. Some women saved them, dropped into hot grease, sweet potato peelings fried into thin curling chips that turned golden at the edges while staying slightly chewy in the center. Sprinkled with salt, they had a sweetness that regular potato chips could never match. Children loved them. A domestic worker who brought home a handful of fried peelings, wrapped in newspaper, was bringing home a treat made from something the white family called garbage. That was the entire economy of that kitchen in a single handful. Number 13, catfish stew. Fresh catfish came to Harlem on the Seaboard airline trains that rolled up from Norfolk twice a week. A pound of clean catfish cost 18 cents in 1928. Kareen's husband, a porter named Walter, brought a pound home every Friday. She cut the fish into chunks, browned them in bacon fat, and simmered them with onion, diced tomato, a splash of vinegar, and a handful of boiled potatoes. The stew thickened in the pot. The fish stayed firm. The broth turned the color of a clay riverbank. Her people had cooked catfish this way on the PD River for generations. A catfish stew in Harlem was a river trip home. Using molasses instead of white sugar was considered old-fashioned and unsophisticated, a mark of poverty rather than deliberate choice. Scientists now recognize that blackstrap molasses contains significant iron, calcium, magnesium, and potassium that refine white sugar strips away during processing. Research confirms that molasses provides antioxidants supporting bone health, blood sugar regulation, and cardiovascular function. African American cooks stirred it into coffee, drizzled it over biscuits, and baked it into gingerbread that satisfied sweet cravings while delivering actual nutrition. Grandmothers kept sticky jars in pantries, using molasses when money was tight, unknowingly choosing the healthier option. What was dismissed as poverty cooking turns out to be nutritional wisdom modern health advocates now recommend. Adding onions to almost everything was dismissed as heavy-handed cooking that masked delicate flavors, yet African American cooks understood that onions provided far more than taste. Scientists recognize that onions contain prebiotic compounds that feed beneficial gut bacteria, supporting immune function. Research confirms that cooking onions releases sulfur compounds that may help regulate blood sugar and reduce inflammation. The flavor transformation from sharp raw onion to sweet caramelized base created depth no other vegetable matched. Grandmothers started nearly every pot with onions sizzling in fat, building foundations for greens, beans, and stews. What seemed like monotonous reliance on one ingredient was health-promoting tradition modern nutrition endorses. Those onions were doing medicinal work while making food taste better. Stewed tomatoes could turn sharp and sour if you let them, especially the ones canned at the end of summer when the fruit came in fast and acidic. The fix was a pinch of sugar, sometimes two, stirred in while the pot was still bubbling. It did not make the tomatoes sweet. It rounded them out, pulled back that bite that sat on the back of your tongue. This trick showed up in spaghetti sauce, ladled over white rice, in tomato gravy, spooned across biscuits, in the base of any stew where canned tomatoes formed the backbone. She never explained why it worked. She just tapped the sugar bowl with a teaspoon, let a little fall in, stirred once, and tasted. If you asked, she might say the tomatoes were angry and needed calming down. That was all the science you were going to get. You could hear it before you saw it. The moment that batter hit the iron, there was a sound, a hard, immediate sizzle, like the pan was sealing a deal, and you knew the crust was already forming on the bottom before the top had even set. That sound was the trick. The cast iron had been heating in the oven for at least 10 minutes, and when cold batter touched that surface, the fat drove moisture into instant steam, puffing the inside while the outside crisped. This is why cornbread baked in a cold dish and cornbread baked in a screaming hot cast iron are two entirely different creatures from the exact same batter. African American cooks across the South understood this long before food science had a word for it. The skillet went in first always, and the batter went in last. You poured fast because every second of contact between cold batter and hot iron was building that crust. The dark gold bottom, slightly smoky from the seasoned surface, that was not an accident. That was something learned by listening.
Peanut shell tea was one of those humble tricks that proved nothing ever went to waste. When peanuts were boiled for snacks, families would save the discarded shells, boil them in water, and strain the liquid to make a faintly nutty tea. It had a thin, earthy flavor, more comforting than bold, but it filled mugs and warmed bellies when nothing else was available. For households short on coffee or other luxuries, peanut shell tea was a way to make do, a reminder that every scrap could serve a purpose. Children sometimes wrinkled their noses at its taste, but adults appreciated its warmth and thrift. It was more than just a drink. It was survival steeped in resourcefulness. Today, it has been nearly forgotten, remembered only in stories of lean times and hard winters. Peanut shell tea reflected a mindset where creativity was as important as ingredients. It is a reminder that sometimes even the husk of something familiar could be transformed into a simple comfort.
Number 19, screaming the skillet hot before the batter goes in. This is the one trick that separated their cornbread from everyone else's, and it started with patience. The greased iron pan went into the oven empty or sat over the open flame until it was almost smoking. Cooks listened for it, and they watched it, looking for the first thin wisp of smoke off the grease. When a drop of batter hit that surface and hissed like water on a stove lid, the pan was ready, and not 1 second before. Only then did the rest of the batter go in, and the whole bowl would crackle and spit the moment it touched the metal. That violent first contact set the crust instantly before the inside ever began to cook. The bottom seared and sealed itself in the time it took to set the bowl down. The result was an edge so crisp it cracked like glass when you cut it, golden brown all the way around, while the middle stayed tender and steamed soft. A cold pan gave you pale, greasy bread that stuck and stewed in its own moisture instead of searing. The hot pan gave you that lacquered bottom every Sunday plate fought over, the peace children begged for. It took no extra money, only the patience to wait out the heat. Heat the iron until it scares you, then pour. Number 18, ash lye hominy. This is the one that regulators tried hardest to stop. Black families in the Deep South soaked dried corn kernels in a solution of water and hardwood ash to make hominy. The lye from the ash dissolved the tough outer hull of the corn and transformed it into something softer, larger, and far more nutritious. The process is called nixtamalization. Nobody in rural Alabama used that word. They called it making lye hominy. Public health officials banned the sale of homemade lye hominy in several states by the 1970s because lye is caustic and improperly prepared batches could cause chemical burns. The caution was not unreasonable, but the technique itself was brilliant. Nixtamalization releases niacin that is otherwise locked inside the corn. Without it, communities that depend on corn develop pellagra, a devastating deficiency disease. Indigenous peoples knew this thousands of years ago. Black families inherited the knowledge and kept it alive. Scientists did not fully explain the biochemistry until the late 20th century. The women who made lye hominy every fall were preventing a disease they had never heard of. When the government said stop, families who listened got sicker. Families who kept their ash hoppers in the backyard did not. Number 16, rescuing scorched milk with cold tap water and a clean pan. A pot of milk that turned its back on you for 30 seconds could fill the whole house with a burnt smell that lingered for days. Big Mama did not throw it out. She lifted the scorched pot off the heat, set it straight into a sink of cold tap water without stirring, and waited 2 full minutes. The cold shock kept the burnt layer welded to the bottom of the pot instead of mixing up into the rest of the milk. Then she gently poured the still good milk off the top into a fresh, clean pan and finished cooking it without a hint of scorch. The trick saved gravy, it saved oatmeal, it saved more pots of grits than any son or daughter cared to count, and the burnt pot soaked overnight in baking soda water came clean by morning. Number 18, thinning milk to make it stretch the full week. A gallon of milk was expensive relative to what a sharecropping family actually earned. So grandmothers stretched it. Half a glass of whole milk, half a glass of water, a tiny pinch of sugar stirred in. For cooking, the milk went even further. A splash in the cornbread batter, a careful pour in the gravy, a measured cup in the banana pudding. Nobody got a full glass to drink at the table. Nobody complained. The trick was distributing the nutrition across every single meal instead of letting anybody pour it all at once. 1 gallon could last a full week in a house with 5 or 6 children because it was never consumed straight. It was always stretched into something larger. Adding vinegar to pot liquor was Grandma's secret for greens that tasted brighter and more complex than anyone else's recipe. After collards or turnips simmered for hours with smoked meat, she added a splash of apple cider or white vinegar in the final minutes. This small addition cut through the richness of pork fat, balanced the mineral depth of the greens, and added subtle tang, making every bite more interesting. The vinegar also broke down tough fibers, ensuring greens were silky tender. That pot liquor, the precious broth left behind, became a tonic. Grandma insisted was good for colds and broken hearts alike. Families sopped it up with cornbread, drinking in vitamins and comfort. This simple trick elevated humble greens into something tasting like love. Using bacon grease to season cast iron skillets was the cornerstone of African American kitchen maintenance for generations. Grandmothers carefully saved rendered bacon fat in ceramic crocks kept near the stove, using it to coat skillets after each washing and before storage. Scientists now confirm that animal fats create superior polymerized seasoning layers compared to vegetable oils, bonding more effectively with iron at high temperatures. The practice produced naturally non-stick surfaces that improve with age and continued use. This technique was taught to daughters standing at their mother's elbows, watching simple pork fat transform rough metal into cooking treasures. The seasoned skillets became family heirlooms passed down through generations with pride. Number 17, stewed tomatoes over rice. When garden tomatoes ripened faster than the family could eat them, the domestic worker cooked the soft ones down in a pot with a little salt and sugar. The tomatoes collapsed into a thick, sweet sauce that smelled like summer concentrated into a single spoonful. Poured over a scoop of leftover rice, it made a full meal without using a single ingredient anyone would miss. Some women added a sliced onion to the pot. Some stirred in a piece of fatback for body. The color alone made the plate look like something planned. It was not planned. It was what happened when a woman looked at what was about to spoil and turned it into supper before the waste bucket got it first. Number 16, coffee-soaked bread. The family drank fresh coffee at breakfast. What remained in the pot sat on the stove going bitter through the afternoon. By the time the domestic worker took her own break, the coffee was dark and lukewarm. A piece of day-old bread torn and dropped into the cup softened into something between porridge and a drink. Some women added a pour of cane syrup to cut the bitterness. Some added nothing. The bread turned dark and heavy in the cup, absorbing the liquid until it could be eaten with a spoon. Coffee-soaked bread was not a recipe anyone would write down. It was a gesture of fatigue. A woman too tired to chew a dry crust found a way to make it go down easier. The cup went back on the counter, and the afternoon continued. Number 19, sweet potato pone. A pone was not a pie. Pones had no crust. Corrine grated 3 sweet potatoes by hand, beat in 1 egg, a cup of cane syrup, a spoon of nutmeg, and a pour of evaporated milk. The whole mixture went into a buttered pan and baked in a neighbor's oven until the top went crackly brown. The inside stayed custardy, almost pudding. A slice of sweet potato pone at a rent party in 1928 sold for a nickel. The cooks made them by the dozen on Friday nights, and the pans were empty by midnight. Her aunt in Charleston had made pone for Sunday dinner as far back as Corrine could remember. Same grater, same pan, same sweet smell rolling down the hallway. That is the incredible thing about a recipe that never changed. It did not have to. Using cornmeal in batters and breading was seen as cheap substitute for proper wheat flour by those unfamiliar with Southern cooking. African American cooks knew that cornmeal created textures wheat flour alone could never achieve. Scientists confirmed that cornmeal's coarser texture creates crispier coatings that stay crunchy longer, while its natural sugars promote better browning through caramelization. Research shows that corn's protein structure absorbs less oil than wheat-based batters, making fried foods lighter. Grandmothers dredged their catfish and okra in seasoned cornmeal, producing golden crusts that shattered satisfyingly. The technique was born from necessity, but perfected into preference. What seemed like making do with available ingredients was superior technique, delivering better results than expensive alternatives. Saving and using meat drippings was labeled as unhealthy habit that would raise cholesterol, yet African American cooks treasured every drop that rendered from their roasts and bacon. Scientists now understand that meat drippings contain fat-soluble vitamins and compounds that processed fats lack entirely. Research confirms that natural animal fats provide stable cooking mediums that do not produce harmful compounds at high temperatures like vegetable oils can. Grandmothers poured drippings into ceramic crocks, using them to season vegetables, make gravies, and add richness to cornbread. The practice stretched food budgets while adding flavor and nutrition store-bought fats could not match. What dietitians condemned for decades, nutrition science now acknowledges as traditional wisdom worth preserving. Evaporated milk sat in every pantry, stacked 2 or 3 cans deep because it did not spoil and it cost less than cream. When the recipe called for something richer than regular milk, but the budget did not stretch to heavy cream, that small can with the condensed sweetness inside answered the call. It went into sweet potato pie filling, into cake batter, into custard, into the base of homemade ice cream, churned by hand on the porch. The milk had already been heated to remove 60% of its water, which concentrated the sugars and proteins, giving it a natural caramel undertone that fresh milk could never match. Carnation was the brand most kitchens kept, and the can opener that punched 2 triangular holes in the top left marks as familiar as a fingerprint. In the 1940s and 50s, when refrigeration was unreliable in rural Black homes across the South, evaporated milk was not a substitute, it was the standard, and the cakes that came from those kitchens tasted richer than anything made with cream. If the measuring cup was wherever it was, and if you couldn't find it, you used the cup already on the counter. A standard coffee mug holds roughly 8 ounces, close enough to a cup that in most quick bread and cake recipes, the difference vanishes in the final product. African American grandmothers who had been baking by feel for decades occasionally conceded a measuring cup for the benefit of a grandchild who needed numbers, but the cup they handed over was often a jelly glass or a heavy mug from the cabinet. The real lesson was not precision, it was proportion. As long as the ratio of wet to dry stayed consistent, the vessel used to measure it was largely irrelevant. Baking chemistry operates on ratios, not absolute volumes. The women who knew this didn't explain it because they demonstrated it every time they baked. The grandchildren who watched carefully understood. The ones who asked too many questions were handed the cup and told to start measuring.
Dandelion coffee was a creative substitute during lean years, when real coffee was too expensive or unavailable. Families dug up dandelion roots, roasted them until dark, and ground them into a coarse powder brewed like coffee. The drink was bitter, earthy, and warming, offering a small comfort in times of scarcity. It lacked caffeine, but it filled the ritual of morning mugs and shared breaks. Children sometimes joined adults in sipping it, finding the flavor strange but familiar. For many, dandelion coffee symbolized thrift and resilience, proof that even weeds could be transformed into something useful. It carried cultural weight as a practice of ingenuity, showing that nothing in nature was overlooked. Today, it is nearly forgotten outside of foraging enthusiasts or health circles. Once a poor man's drink, it now reflects a lost chapter of survival cooking. Dandelion coffee remains a story of adaptation, born of necessity but remembered with pride for its creativity.
Number 3, saving stale cornbread for the holiday dressing. A good cook never looked at day-old bread and saw garbage. She saw next week's dressing. The leftover pan went uncovered on the counter to dry out hard or got crumbled and spread on a sheet to go stale on purpose because fresh, moist cornbread would only turn to paste once the broth hit it. Dried and crumbled, it drank up the turkey stock, the sage, the onion and celery, and beaten egg, and held its shape into a savory golden dressing that anchored every holiday table. That dish was the crown of Thanksgiving and Christmas in Southern Black kitchens, a recipe guarded and argued over and handed down like an heirloom. Its roots run back to a dish enslaved cooks called kush, crumbled leftover cornbread, stretched with onion and herbs from the garden, a way to make a thin ration go further that grew over time into the holiday dressing we still prize today. The everyday bread gone stale became the centerpiece of the year's biggest meal. It was the thrift of the kitchen turned into a celebration. Scarcity remembered even in plenty. Nothing was ever wasted, least of all good cornbread. Let it go stale on purpose, and the humble pan becomes the holiday's finest dish. Number 25, salt box pork curing. Before refrigeration reached Black homes in the rural South, salt was the only thing standing between your family and hunger. A hog was slaughtered in November when the air turned cold. Every cut was rubbed thick with coarse salt and stacked in a wooden box, layer after layer, like bricks in a wall, with salt packed between each piece. The meat sat for weeks, drawing moisture out through osmosis until bacteria could not survive on its surface. That box was the family's bank account in meat. The USDA later said this method was unreliable because home cooks could not measure salinity precisely enough. But food scientists at Texas A&M have confirmed that salt concentrations above 6% create conditions where salmonella and E. coli cannot reproduce. Your great-grandmother did not own a salinity meter. She used her hands and her mother's memory. The pork lasted through March. That was enough. Number 23, testing hot oil with the wooden spoon handle. Before a single piece of chicken hit the grease, Big Mama lowered the dry end of a wooden spoon straight down into the pot. If the wood sat there quiet, the oil was cold and the chicken would sit in it like a sponge. If a slow string of pearl bubbles climbed the handle, the oil was right around 350 degrees, the temperature every fried chicken recipe in the world will tell you to chase. If the bubbles came up fast and angry, she slid the pot off the eye and waited. No clip-on thermometer ever lived in her kitchen. The wood told the truth every time because moisture trapped in the grain reacted to the heat of the oil with predictable bubbling, and once you had seen it, you never forgot what right looked like. Her chicken came out the color of polished walnut, and the crust never went soggy on the plate. Number 9, drying fruit and preserving it without any equipment. When the garden and the fruit trees were producing more than the family could eat fresh, nothing went to waste and nothing needed a freezer. Herbs got tied in small bunches and hung upside down from a nail on the porch or a rafter in the kitchen until they were brittle enough to crumble into storage jars. Hot peppers were threaded on a length of string and draped across the kitchen window like a curtain. Slice, peaches, and apple rings were spread on window screens, propped up on sawhorses in the full sun, and left to shrink into leathery strips that kept through winter. No electricity required, no canning jars, just open air and patience. A grandmother with a full shelf of dry goods by October had already won the winter months before the first cold night arrived. The mayonnaise cake became legendary at church bake sales, where it always sold out first. Using buttermilk to tenderize catfish was essential knowledge in Black Southern kitchens, where fish fries were community celebrations. Before dredging catfish in seasoned cornmeal, Grandma soaked fillets in buttermilk for at least an hour, sometimes overnight. The acid in buttermilk broke down proteins in the fish, making flesh more tender while removing any muddy taste river catfish sometimes carried. The buttermilk also helped cornmeal coating stick better, creating that perfect golden crust everyone loved. This technique transformed inexpensive pond-raised fish into something tasting like it came from a fancy restaurant. Grandma learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers, an unbroken chain of knowledge about making simple ingredients taste extraordinary. The buttermilk soak was non-negotiable for truly great fried catfish. Placing brown paper bags under fresh baked bread to cool was wisdom passed down through generations of African American bakers. The paper absorbed excess moisture while allowing just enough steam to escape, preventing soggy crust while keeping the interior tender. Modern food scientists now understand this creates perfect humidity balance, maintaining bread quality far better than cooling racks. Grandmothers knew instinctively what laboratories took decades to confirm. The brown paper's porous structure wickered away condensation without removing essential moisture from the crumb. Women saved their grocery bags specifically for this purpose, washing and reusing them until worn thin. Church bake sales featured loaves, cooled this way, their crusts perfectly crisp. Number 22, hard-boiled egg from the pantry. Eggs were counted in most white households, but not always carefully. A domestic worker who boiled a dozen for the family's deviled eggs or potato salad could set one aside without anyone noticing. Eaten whole with a pinch of salt, a hard-boiled egg was the quietest meal in the kitchen. No plate, no cooking smell, no evidence. Just protein, eaten in 2 bites between tasks. Some women kept a boiled egg wrapped in a cloth in their apron pocket for the walk home. An egg carried that way stayed warm for an hour. It was food that fit in a closed hand and left nothing behind. No crumbs, no wrapper, no dish to wash. A woman could eat it on the road and arrive home with her hands empty and her stomach settled. Number 22, hoe cakes on the coal stove. A hoe cake was the oldest bread in African American cooking. Older than cornbread, older than biscuits. The name came from the field hands who baked them on the blade of a garden hoe held over open flame. In Kareen's fourth floor kitchen, the hoe was a cast iron griddle, but the recipe had not changed in 150 years. Cornmeal, salt, lard, water, that was it. She mixed it thin, spooned it onto the hot griddle, and flipped it once. 2 minutes aside, a stack of 6 hoe cakes and a tin of molasses fed the whole household on a Sunday morning for under a dime. The old timers at the stoop said a hoe cake was the taste of every generation that came before you. Every single one of them had eaten the same bread. Here are 100 genius Big Mama kitchen tricks you will wish you knew sooner. The cookbook industry spent decades ignoring those techniques. The kitchens that invented them never noticed. Pick one and try it this week. Test your oil with a wooden spoon, save your bacon grease, and see what it does to a pot of beans. Season your cast iron the way your grandmother did, not the way the internet tells you to. Drop the kitchen trick your family swore by in the comments. Tell us what she did and where she learned it. The Skillet is still teaching.